Welcome, welcome. You're here at Eclipse Wizardry. Today we present to you, what if Fleur and Hermione both sensed Harry's power age 8 and know which in Britain could break bond. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Pulse. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive smelled like dust and old trainers and something that might have been damp wood if you were being charitable about it. Harry Potter had lived in it for as long as he could remember, and he had stopped noticing the smell years ago, the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic when you've grown up near a motorway. It was simply the texture of his life, unremarkable and constant. He was 8 years old and he was currently lying on his back on the narrow cot, staring at the underside of the stairs above him, tracing the grain of the wood with his eyes because there was nothing else to do. Dudley had broken his only book 3 days ago, had simply taken it from Harry's hands and bent the spine backward until the pages fanned out like a broken wing. It had been a library book about birds. Harry had cried about it in private and then spent 2 days figuring out how to tape it back together well enough that the library might not notice. He hadn't managed it. Outside the cupboard, the Dursley household was in full Sunday afternoon mode, which meant Vernon was watching football with the volume turned up high enough to rattle the thin cupboard door. Petunia was doing something in the kitchen that involved a great deal of pot clanging, and Dudley was almost certainly torturing something in the garden. He'd gotten a magnifying glass for his birthday. Harry tried not to think about the ants. The thing about living the way Harry lived was that you got very good at measuring the weight of silence. He could tell from the specific quality of the quiet between the football commentary whether Vernon was in a mood that might pass or one that was building toward something. He could tell from the rhythm of the pot clanging whether Petunia was stressed or simply busy. These were survival skills dressed up as ordinary attention, and Harry had developed them so naturally that he didn't think of them as skills at all. He just thought of them as knowing. Right now, what he knew was that something was wrong. Not wrong in the house, that was a constant low-grade wrongness he'd long since filed under background noise. Wrong somewhere else, somewhere indefinable, like a word on the tip of his tongue that he couldn't quite reach. He'd been feeling it for about an hour, a kind of pressure behind his sternum, like the air before a thunderstorm. He pressed his palm flat against his chest and stared at the wood grain above him and breathed slowly the way he did when he was trying not to cry, which was a technique he discovered also worked for most other varieties of uncomfortable feeling. The television volume dropped suddenly. Harry went still. "Boy." Vernon's voice. Right outside the cupboard door. Harry had not heard him cross the sitting room, which was bad. He'd been too distracted by the feeling in his chest and he'd missed the warning. "Boy, I know you're in there. Get out here." Harry sat up, knocked his head on the sloped ceiling because he always misjudged it when he moved quickly, and pushed the cupboard door open. Vernon Dursley was a large man in every dimension. He had a face that had been designed, it seemed, specifically for expressions of displeasure, and it was currently wearing one of its better ones, the compressed lips, narrowed eyes combination that Harry privately categorized as looking for a reason. He was holding the newspaper, which he'd rolled up without apparent purpose, and he was looking down at Harry the way he always looked at Harry, which was like something unpleasant had appeared on his carpet. "Did you touch Dudley's computer?" "No. Don't give me that tone." "I didn't say anything with a tone." That had been a mistake. Harry recognized at the moment it came out of his mouth. He'd been so distracted by the pressure in his chest that his usual filter had slipped, and the words had come out flat and factual rather than carefully apologetic. Vernon's face shifted from looking for a reason to found one. "Don't get clever with me. Dudley says you were in his room." "I wasn't." "You calling my son a liar?" Harry looked at him steadily. He'd learned, through careful empirical observation, that there was almost no correct answer to this question. Saying yes got you punished. Saying no got you punished for having lied about Dudley. The only viable option was to say nothing and absorb whatever was coming with as little reaction as possible, because reaction prolonged things. So he said nothing. Vernon grabbed his arm above the elbow, the way he always did when he was escalating, thick fingers pressing hard enough to leave marks, and marched him toward the kitchen. "Petunia, this boy has been in Dudley's room again, I haven't." The word came out before Harry could stop it, quiet and certain. Not defiant, not frightened. Just accurate. He hadn't been in Dudley's room. He was almost never in Dudley's room because Dudley's room smelled like synthetic cheese and aggression, and there was nothing in it Harry wanted. Vernon stopped walking. He turned to look at Harry with an expression that had moved past the usual categories into something colder and more deliberate. "What did you just say to me?" The pressure in Harry's chest was getting worse. It had shifted from a vague uncomfortable weight to something that felt almost like a heartbeat, a second heartbeat, rapid and insistent, layered over his own. His vision felt strange at the edges, slightly too bright, the way things looked sometimes when he was running a fever. He pressed his free hand against his sternum again. "I said I haven't been in his room." He kept his voice even. "I've been in the cupboard all afternoon. You can check." "I don't need to check anything in my own house, boy, Vernon." Petunia had come to the kitchen doorway. Her face had the specific expression she wore when she thought things might spiral past what was comfortable for her, not concern for Harry. Harry had no illusions about that, but a kind of aesthetic distaste for messiness. "What's happened?" This boy is giving me lip, I'm telling you what's true," Harry said. The brightness at the edges of his vision intensified. The second heartbeat in his chest had become almost painful, like something pressing outward against the inside of his ribs, urgent and building. He could feel something gathering in him the way weather gathered, without warning and with absolute intention. "You don't get to tell me anything." Vernon's voice had gone up half an octave, which was always the last stage before he stopped talking entirely and started doing other things with his hands. "You are nothing in this house, do you understand me? You are nothing. You eat our food and you sleep under our stairs and you are nothing and you will not stand there." And the light in the kitchen changed. It happened between one breath and the next, a white gold pulse, like a flashbulb but warmer and vastly bigger, emanating from Harry's chest outward in a perfect sphere. It made no sound. It passed through the walls of the house and kept going. It passed through the garden fence and the neighbors' gardens and the road beyond. It passed through Surrey and it didn't stop. It had no malice in it and no fear. It was simply the truest possible expression of what Harry was, released all at once because the container had been pressed past its limits for just a moment too long, and something had to give. Vernon flew backward. Not violently, it wasn't that kind of force. He simply went back 2 feet as if a strong, gentle hand had pushed him, and sat down hard on the kitchen floor with a look of profound bewilderment replacing everything that had been on his face before. The hanging light fixture swung. Every pot on the rack rattled once, a clear resonant note, like someone striking a bell. Petunia's carefully arranged tea towels fluttered. And then it was quiet. Harry stood in the middle of the kitchen floor breathing steadily, the pressure in his chest gone completely, replaced by an absence so absolute it felt like standing in cool water after a long run. He looked at Vernon sitting on the floor. He looked at Petunia in the doorway with both hands pressed to her mouth. He looked at his own hands, which were perfectly still. He felt nothing like fear. He felt nothing like regret. "I wasn't in Dudley's room," he said again, and went back to his cupboard. Fleur Delacour had a garden that she tended with the kind of attention most people reserved for fine art. It ran along the south-facing wall of their house in Avignon, roses and lavender and late-summer sunflowers, and her elder daughter liked to sit among them on Sunday afternoons pretending to read while actually watching the insects move through the flowers with the focused, cataloguing attention that she applied to everything she found genuinely interesting. Fleur was 11 years old and she was reading a book about the history of magical bonds in European wizarding tradition, which was not assigned reading for beaux batons and which she had found in her grandmother's library and smuggled home under her robe. It was dense and old and smelled of pressed flowers, and Fleur had read 40 pages of it in the last hour because the subject had captured her in a way she couldn't entirely articulate, a persistent feeling, like hearing a song she didn't know the words to but could follow anyway by instinct. She was on a passage about what the text called resonance bonds when it happened. It hit her in the sternum, that was the only way to describe it, physically. A pulse of something that had no business reaching Avignon from wherever it originated, warm and gold and entirely impossible to ignore, like a note struck on an instrument tuned to the exact frequency of her own heartbeat. She dropped the book. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand up, and she stood in the garden with her hand pressed flat against her chest and her other hand extended slightly as if she could feel which direction it had come from. North. Northwest. England. She knew this with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely and arrived fully formed, the way knowing your own name arrived. Maman. Her voice came out strangely. Not frightened. Focused. Apollon appeared at the garden door almost immediately, wearing the expression she reserved for situations that had not yet announced what kind of situation they were. She was a beautiful woman with silver blonde hair and sharp blue eyes, and she looked at her daughter standing rigid in the middle of the lavender with her hand on her chest and moved toward her without a word. Something happened, Fleur said. Her French came out rapid and certain. Something, there's someone. In England. I don't know how I know that, Maman, but I know. Apollon reached her and took her face in both hands and looked at her the way she sometimes looked at things in her garden, carefully, assessing, reading something below the surface. What did it feel like? Fleur searched for the word. Like finding the right answer. The exact right answer. Like, she stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of language. Like something fitting together that I didn't know was waiting to fit. Apollon's expression shifted, not to panic, but to something more careful. Something cautious and old, like a door opening onto a room she'd hoped she wouldn't have to enter. Come inside, she said quietly. Maman, what is it? You know what it is. Come inside, Fleur. That night, after her mother had made tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table with the specific posture of someone choosing their words like they were choosing footing on an unstable slope, Fleur learned about Triad Resonance for the first time. Not in detail, Apollon was careful, measured, clearly editing as she went. But the shape of it. The rarity. The fact that it was not a bond that had been chosen so much as one that had been recognized, three magical cores finding each other the way water found its own level. It doesn't mean you're bound, Apollon said carefully. Not yet. It is only the first recognition. Many resonances never fully form. But mine will, Fleur said. It wasn't a question. Apollon looked at her daughter for a long moment. You don't know that. I know, Fleur said, the same way I know where it came from. I've been right about things before when I've known them this way. You know I have. Apollon looked down at her tea. Outside, the Avignon night was warm and full of crickets and smelled of her garden. The boy, she said, very quietly. Whoever he is. He must be very young. Fleur thought about the quality of what she'd felt. The size of it. The rawness of it. Not controlled power, not trained power, but something entirely unmanaged and therefore entirely itself, like a river before anyone had thought to build a dam. Yes, she said. And very powerful. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and felt, with perfect clarity, the faint gold thread in her chest that hadn't been there this morning, delicate as a single strand of silk and already completely unbreakable. I want to know his name, she said. The Granger's house in London was a semi-detached in Hampstead that always smelled slightly of dental antiseptic because both her parents were dentists and the scent had soaked into the walls over years. Hermione did not find this smell unpleasant. She found it comforting in the way that specific smells attached to safety always were. She was sitting at her desk in her bedroom, which had been recently reorganized for the fourth time this summer because reorganizing her books gave her a sense of control she found difficult to achieve through other means. She was currently working through a history of medieval Europe, not assigned reading. She was 8, no one was assigning her anything over summer holiday, with the slightly feverish concentration she applied to anything that genuinely interested her, which was most things. The feeling hit her mid-sentence. She read the word Canterbury and then the pulse arrived and the word became meaningless and every other word on the page became meaningless, and she sat very still at her desk with both hands flat on the open book and her breath coming in shallow, rapid pulls that she was trying to regulate because she was frightened, very slightly, by the magnitude of what she was feeling. She was not frightened of the feeling itself. That was the strange part. The feeling itself was, good wasn't the right word. Good was too small. The feeling itself was like being told something true that she'd always known but couldn't have articulated before the moment of being told it. Like a definition finally given for a concept she'd been circling around for years. She pressed her hand over her heart and the other hand to the window glass and looked out at Hampstead in the early Sunday evening light, and the tears that came down her face were not sad tears. She would recognize them later, years later, as the tears that come from relief so large the body doesn't know what else to do with it. She had always known she was different. Not in the way children were told they were special as a matter of routine encouragement, she'd understood early that those assurances were generic and largely meaningless. She was different in a specific, verifiable way that manifested in books reading faster than they should, in pencils rolling toward her hand when she reached for them, in the time the classroom lights had gone out during her maths test and she'd been very upset about it, and in approximately 40 other incidents she'd catalogued in a small green notebook she kept under her mattress. She was different, and the difference had a shape she could almost see, and she'd been 8 years old for 6 months now and no one had explained any of it to her. The pulse explained it. Not in words. But in the way a key explains a lock, by fitting. She found the green notebook under the mattress. She opened it to a new page, found her pen, and wrote in her careful, small handwriting, August 7, 1988. Something happened. There's someone, a boy, I think, I don't know why I think that, somewhere nearby. Not geographically. But near. I felt it in my chest. I felt a second person too, further away, French, maybe? That makes no sense but I'm fairly sure. She paused, tapping the pen against her lips. Then she wrote, I don't think I'm imagining this. I'm going to find out what it is. She closed the notebook and looked out the window again. The evening light was doing something lovely to the rooftops. She had 2 years before Hogwarts. She'd already read every book in the local library twice, and she'd started placing holds at the British Library on anything she could get a reader's card for. She'd found 3 books that danced around the subject of what she probably was, though none of them came right out and said it because they were shelved in the folklore section and written for adults who mostly considered them academic curiosities rather than field guides. 2 years to find out what a Triad Resonance was. She was not worried. She was, in fact, electrified. She went downstairs and ate supper with her parents and answered questions about her day with the slightly distracted quality she sometimes had when she was thinking very hard about something else entirely, and her parents exchanged the particular glance they exchanged when this happened, fond, slightly bewildered, resigned to having produced a daughter who operated at a frequency they couldn't always tune into. After supper, she went back upstairs, pulled out the green notebook, and started a list. Number 4, Privet Drive was very quiet after the incident in the kitchen. Vernon had not spoken to Harry for the rest of Sunday, which was unusual but not entirely unwelcome. He'd sat in the living room for an hour after being helped up from the floor by a white-faced Petunia, and the expression on his face was one Harry had never seen before, not rage, not displeasure, but something genuinely unsettled, like a man who had walked into a room and found the furniture arranged in a way that shouldn't have been physically possible. Dudley had been in the garden when it happened and had come inside to find his father on the floor. He hadn't said anything at dinner either. Petunia had made lamb chops as if nothing had occurred. She'd served them with roasted potatoes and green beans and she'd put a plate on the floor outside Harry's cupboard door with a precision and deliberateness that suggested she was working very hard at being normal, and Harry had eaten it in his cupboard with the door slightly open and listened to the careful, brittle silence of the dining room and thought about the feeling that had left his chest. He thought about it all through the evening and into the night, lying on his narrow cot with his hands folded on his stomach, staring at the wood grain above him. He'd had incidents before. He knew what they were, knew in the way he knew most important things, which was through careful private observation and zero corroboration from anyone around him, because no one around him had ever been inclined to help him make sense of anything. Things happened when he was very emotional. Lights blew out. Food went strange. Once, during a particularly bad week in year 2, the glass in the greenhouse at school had repaired itself overnight after Dudley had broken it while chasing Harry through it. Harry had known he'd done it without knowing how he'd done it. The pattern was clear and consistent and completely outside anything he could find in any book he'd managed to read. But tonight had felt different. Not the mechanics of it, the accidental magic was familiar, but the scale of it. And more than that, the feeling after. The absence of the pressure. And the thing that had replaced it. There were 2 threads in his chest that hadn't been there this morning. He pressed his palm flat and felt them both, not physically, not in the way he felt his heartbeat, but in some other register that he didn't have a name for. One felt close. London, maybe. Not Surrey but London, which was near enough that he could feel its direction clearly. The other felt much further away. Across water. Somewhere warm, he thought, which was a strange thing to think but he thought it anyway. He turned onto his side and looked at the sliver of light coming under the cupboard door from the hallway nightlight. There were 2 people in the world who'd felt what he'd done. He didn't know their names or their faces. He knew nothing specific about them at all. But he knew, with exactly the same certainty that he knew how to breathe and how to read and how to make himself invisible in a room full of people who wanted to hurt him, that they were real and that the threads connecting them were real and that this particular thing, whatever it was not going to go away. Good, he thought. He had not had a friend in his life. Not one. He'd had Dudley's gang on one side and everyone else on the other, moving out of his way because moving out of Harry Potter's way was easier than dealing with Dudley's gang's opinion of you. He'd had teachers who liked him and then got confused looks on their faces when his marks were better than Dudley's and then got careful looks on their faces and stopped calling on him so much. He'd had the library. He'd had the Bird's book. He'd had himself. Which was enough to survive on. Not enough for anything better. The threads in his chest were thin as silk and warm as afternoon light. Good, he thought again, and closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he slept easily and without dreams. Monday morning arrived at Privet Drive with overcast skies and the sound of Vernon's car engine in the driveway at 7:45 as he left for work without saying anything. Harry made breakfast. He'd been making breakfast since he was 5 years old, not legally, not appropriately, but practically, because Petunia had discovered he could reach the cooker by standing on a step stool and had realized immediately that this was information she could use. He scrambled eggs and made toast and put it on the table and ate standing by the counter because the rule was that he ate after they did and Dudley hadn't come down yet. When Petunia came into the kitchen she paused at the sight of him in a way that was slightly different from her usual pause, which was the pause of someone deciding not to see something. This pause had a quality of assessment in it. "You'll need to mow the back garden today," she said. "All right." She sat down at the table. She poured tea. Harry watched her from the corner of his eye while he rinsed the bowl he'd used for the eggs. "What happened yesterday," she said finally, "doesn't leave this house. It was an accident. It doesn't leave this house." Harry turned to look at her. She was looking at her tea, not at him, and her jaw was set in the particular way it got when she'd made a decision about something and was not open to discussion of it. "Do you know what it is?" he asked. "What I can do?" A long pause. Petunia's knuckle was white around the handle of her mug. "That doesn't leave this house either," she said. "So you do know." "Harry." Her voice had something in it that was not quite a warning. Was almost, something else. Something he'd never heard in it before, as quickly suppressed as it arrived. Don't push me on this. You'll go to school when it's time and you'll learn what it is when it's time, and until then you will be normal. I'll mow the garden, Harry said. He went outside. The sky above Surrey was the color of old pewter, and the grass was long along the fence where the lawnmower's wheels didn't reach, and he pushed the old electric mower in straight lines back and forth across the lawn and thought about the threads in his chest, which were still there, steady and patient, warm as held breath. He thought about the fact that Aunt Petunia knew. Had always known, clearly. Had chosen containment over information, silence over explanation, normal over everything that Harry actually was. He wasn't angry about it. He'd made peace with the Dursleys as a fact of his life, not a good fact, not a fair fact, but a fact nonetheless, and raging at facts was a waste of energy he'd learned to deploy elsewhere. But he filed it carefully. She knows. She's chosen not to tell me. Whatever it is I am, it's something she recognizes. He finished the lawn and went in and ate the sandwich Petunia left on the counter and went back to his cupboard, and he got out the cleanest piece of paper he had, a sheet he'd been saving from a project he'd finished at school, and he sat cross-legged on his cot and thought for a while. Then he wrote, in his small, clear handwriting, I don't know if you can feel this. But I can feel you. Both of you. I don't know what this is. But I think it's real and I think you're real, and if you can write back to this address, I'd like to know who you are. He folded it carefully. He didn't have an envelope or a stamp, and he had no idea how to address a letter to someone whose name he didn't know and whose address was somewhere in London and somewhere in France respectively. He held it in both hands for a moment, feeling slightly foolish, and then he felt the thread in his chest pull, gentle and certain, like a hand taking his, and the paper warmed in his fingers, and then it was simply gone. Between one breath and the next, as if it had never been. Harry looked at his empty hands. He felt the distance of both threads recalibrate, something shifting like the click of a compass finding north. He'd sent it somehow. He didn't know how. He didn't know if it would arrive. But something in him, the same part of him that catalogued the weight of silences and measured the temperature of the air before storms, was perfectly certain. He lay back on his cot and stared at the wood grain and waited. 3 days later, 2 letters arrived simultaneously, pushed under the cupboard door by something that wasn't wind because there was no wind in the hallway. One smelled of lavender. One smelled of books. He held them both for a long time before he opened either. Then he opened both at once, one in each hand, and read them in the gray summer light coming through the crack under the door, and his chest was so full of something he couldn't name that he had to put both letters down and press his hands over his heart and breathe. Both letters said, in different handwriting and different amounts of words, the same essential thing. I felt it too. I've been waiting. Chapter 2, The Finding 3 years of letters did something to a person. Harry had learned this the way he learned most things, empirically, through observation, with no one to confirm or deny his conclusions. He'd learned that Fleur Delacour had an opinion about everything and stated it with the directness of someone who had never been required to soften herself for other people's comfort, and that this was not arrogance so much as a complete absence of the social anxiety that made most people hedge their words into uselessness. He'd learned that she'd been reading about Triad Resonance since the night of the pulse, that she'd found 4 books on it and cross-referenced all of them, and that her conclusion, delivered in her second letter with characteristic certainty, was that what they had was permanent, old, and completely outside anyone's legal jurisdiction to interfere with. She'd written that last part in underlined French and then, apparently remembering that Harry was still learning French from the library's cassette tapes, translated it herself in brackets. He'd learned that Hermione Granger had also been reading about Triad Resonance, had found 7 books on it, cross-referenced all of them and the historical records at the British Library where she'd talked her way into a junior researcher's pass at age 9 by bringing a letter from her mother that described her as academically advanced, and that her conclusion was functionally identical to Fleur's, arrived at through a more exhaustive process. She'd included footnotes in her 5th letter. Harry had found this unexpectedly endearing. He'd learned that Hermione was terrified of failure in the way that only people who'd never actually failed could be, not a fear born from experience but from anticipation, from imagining the height of the drop. He'd written back that failure was mostly just information and that she should try it sometime. She'd written back a 3-page response that started defensive and ended, in its final paragraph, quieter and more honest than anything she'd written before. He'd kept that letter under his pillow for a week. He'd learned that Fleur hated being looked at for her Vila blood, hated the way people's eyes went soft and greedy, hated that she could walk into a room and have everyone in it immediately want something from her that had nothing to do with who she was. She'd written about it once, briefly, in a way that suggested she didn't usually admit it to anyone, and Harry had written back that he understood the particular exhaustion of being seen wrong, which was different from not being seen at all but equally wearing in its own way. She'd taken 2 weeks to reply to that one, which was unusual. She normally replied within days, and when she did, her letter was shorter than usual and said only, yes. Exactly that. Harry had learned Hermione's handwriting and Fleur's handwriting, and he'd learned the specific feeling in the threads when a letter was coming before it arrived, a warmth and brightening that he'd described to Hermione in a letter and she'd confirmed, and which Fleur had described as comme le soleil entre les nuages, like sun between clouds, in one of the bilingual letters they'd settled into as a compromise because Harry was now decent enough at French and Fleur was impatient with limitations in general. 3 years of letters. And then the Hogwarts letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in late July. Harry was in the garden pulling weeds, which was his assigned task for the morning, and he felt the thread warm just before the owl arrived, a tawny owl with an authoritative air that landed on the garden fence and regarded him with the steady, professional gaze of something that had a job to do and intended to do it. Harry stood up from the weeds and crossed to it and took the letter. The owl held out its leg with the air of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found it no more remarkable than breathing. The envelope was thick cream parchment. His name was on it in green ink. Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He looked at it for a moment, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, printed formally, as if it were a perfectly reasonable place to address a letter to a person, and then he felt a slightly different feeling in his chest, smaller and sharper than the threads. He recognized it after a second. It was offense on his behalf. The magical world knew where he slept and had been sending his mail there for 11 years and hadn't done anything about it. He filed that away and opened the letter. He read it twice, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He went back to pulling weeds. His hands were steady. His mind was moving quickly through logistics, Diagon Alley, school supplies, the vault at Gringotts that the letter mentioned, which meant money somewhere, which meant a great deal he didn't yet know about his own circumstances. He'd deal with one thing at a time. That evening, after supper, he knocked on the sitting room door. Vernon looked up from the television with the expression of a man who had spent 3 years maintaining an uneasy truce with something he didn't understand and didn't want to. "I've got my Hogwarts letter," Harry said. He didn't ask. He stated it, plainly, the way Fleur had taught him by example over 3 years of watching her never phrase anything as a request when it was actually a fact. "I'll need to go to Diagon Alley for supplies. I expect there's money at Gringotts." Vernon opened his mouth. "I'm going," Harry said. Not unkindly. "I just wanted you to know." Vernon looked at Petunia. Petunia was looking at the middle distance with the expression she'd been wearing increasingly often over the past 3 years, somewhere between surrender and relief, as if a problem she'd been bracing against had finally arrived and at least the bracing was over. "Saturday," she said. "I'll take you." Vernon made a sound like a man swallowing something unpleasant. Harry nodded and went back to his cupboard and wrote 2 letters, one to Hermione, one to Fleur, that said simply, "It came. I'll be in Diagon Alley on Saturday. I know we've never, I think we should meet." He held both letters for a moment, feeling the specific warmth of the threads, and let them go. The reply from Hermione came in 4 hours, which was frankly impressive given that it was already evening when he sent his. "Harry, yes. I've had my letter too, it came this morning. I've been waiting all day to write until I knew for certain you had yours. I've been to Diagon Alley once before with my parents, last spring, when Professor McGonagall came to explain things. Yes, a professor came to explain things to my parents. Apparently they do that for Muggleborns. I'll tell you about it in person because I have many thoughts. Saturday. I'll be there. I'll be outside Gringotts at 10 because that seems like a logical starting point. The reply from Fleur came at midnight, which meant she'd either been awake or the thread warmth had woken her, which Harry suspected was increasingly common for all three of them. I cannot come Saturday. I am in France and I cannot simply appear in London. But, Harry, I am 17 days from Beauxbatons enrollment. My mother will not, a crossed-out line. Then, my mother has concerns. But I will find a way to write more once I'm at school. I want you to know, meeting her first, in person, before me. I have thoughts about this. I will tell you in the next letter. Be careful who you tell about the bond. Some people will not understand what it is and will try to make it into something it isn't. Harry read both letters twice. He folded them and put them with the others, a stack now held together with a piece of string he'd found in the kitchen drawer. He turned off the small lamp Petunia had eventually, silently, without comment, left outside his cupboard door sometime during his 9th year, and he lay in the dark and thought about the fact that in 4 days he would meet Hermione Granger in person for the first time, which was strange to consider because in a specific and real sense he already knew her better than he knew anyone in the physical world. He thought about what Fleur had written. Be careful who you tell. He filed that one carefully, in the folder in his mind labeled things people try to take from you. He was familiar with the folder's contents. He knew how to protect things. Saturday arrived gray and smelling of upcoming rain. Petunia drove him to the Leaky Cauldron in complete silence, parked on Charing Cross Road, and waited in the car with the engine off and her hands in her lap and an expression like someone sitting outside a dentist's office. I'll be fine, Harry said. She didn't respond. He got out of the car. The Leaky Cauldron was dim and smelled of old beer and candle smoke, and every head in the place turned when Harry walked in, which had apparently been happening his whole life in the wizarding world and which he was encountering for the first time. He walked through it with the easy, unhurried pace he'd developed for moving through spaces that were paying him unwanted attention, not aggressive, not defensive, simply through, and tapped the correct bricks in the courtyard wall because he'd memorized the instructions from the letter, and Diagon Alley opened up in front of him. He stood at the mouth of it for 10 seconds, taking it in. Then he walked toward Gringotts. She was standing outside the white marble steps at 5 minutes to 10, and he knew her before she saw him, knew the way she stood, which was the stance of someone who had somewhere to be and was calculating the most efficient route while simultaneously reading everything around her. She had bushy brown hair and brown eyes and she was clutching a list in one hand that was, from what he could see at 20 feet, extremely detailed. She saw him and her whole face changed. He'd known her for 3 years. He knew her handwriting and her reasoning and her laugh from the way she described things and the jokes she sometimes made that started dry and got warmer as they went. He knew she was brave in ways she didn't credit herself for and frightened of things she'd never admit to in conversation. He knew she was lonely in the particular way brilliant children were lonely at ordinary schools, surrounded by people, comprehensible to almost none of them. He knew all of this, and she was still, in person, a surprise. Not in what she was but in the realness of her, the warmth of the thread in his chest snapping into sudden, vivid focus in a way it did when they were close, which they'd never been before, and which made him catch his breath slightly. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. Then, "It's stronger when you're nearby." The feeling. I hadn't predicted it would intensify that sharply. I felt it too. From about 20 feet. Interesting. That suggests the range isn't proximity dependent in letters but has a, she stopped. I'm doing the cataloging thing. Sorry. Don't apologize, he said. I like the cataloging thing. It's one of the most you things about you. Hermione looked at him for a second and then smiled, genuinely, without the slight hedge she sometimes put on her expressions in her letters when she was showing vulnerability and wanted a small distance from it. Full and unguarded. Harry felt something in the thread between them settle, like a knot finding its proper configuration. Right, she said, looking back at her list. Gringotts first. Then the bookshop, obviously. Then robes. Do you have your key? The letter said there's a key at Gringotts. That's unusual. Usually it's sent with the letter. Your circumstances are, she caught herself. Different, he supplied. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I know quite a lot about your circumstances. From the books. I didn't want to bring it up in letters because, it felt like the kind of thing you should be able to choose to talk about in your own time. Harry considered this. What do the books say? That you're famous. That you survived something you shouldn't have survived. That most of the wizarding world thinks you did it on purpose, as an infant. They're wrong about that last part, Harry said, not because he remembered it but because it was clearly ridiculous. Obviously. She said it with such complete certainty, as if the alternative was too stupid to entertain, and he felt a sudden, specific gratitude for her that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with 3 years of letters and the way she'd never once treated him as a story. They went up the marble steps. The goblins at Gringotts were not what he'd expected, though he hadn't expected anything specific. The vaults were underground and accessed by a cart that moved faster than physics seemed strictly comfortable with, and the goblin who took them down, a Mr. Griphook, assigned after Harry presented himself at the main desk and said his name and watched the resulting ripple move through the hall with private interest, was efficient and quiet in a way Harry respected. His vault was large. He stood in it and looked at the piles of gold and silver and bronze and felt nothing much in particular, which he thought was probably strange but couldn't locate the appropriate emotional response. It was money. He had money. He'd had no money. Now he had money. He took enough for school supplies and put it in the leather pouch Griphook provided. There is, Griphook said, as they were preparing to leave, a secondary vault. Potter Family Holdings. It requires your presence at 17 for the formal unsealing. But there is a document. Harry stopped. What kind of document? A letter. Sealed. Addressed to you by your father. It has been waiting since your parents' deaths. Griphook's voice was professionally neutral. We are required by law to inform you of its existence at the first Gringotts visit. We are not required to tell you anything about its contents. Harry looked at the goblin for a moment. I'd like to have it, please. It is sealed until you are 17. Can I hold it? Griphook considered this with the air of someone evaluating a request that was technically within the bounds of the rules. I see no reason to refuse that. The letter was a cream envelope, smaller than he'd expected, slightly yellowed, sealed with a wax impression of a stag. Harry held it in both hands and felt the age of it, 11 years of waiting in the dark, underwater, beneath London. His father's handwriting on the front. For Harry, when he is ready. He slid it into his pocket next to the Hogwarts letter. Hermione, beside him, was very quiet. Let's go to the bookshop, he said. Flourish and Blots was busy, late July busy, every family with a Hogwarts student apparently converging on the same Saturday, and Harry and Hermione moved through it with the comfortable efficiency of people who knew how to use a bookshop properly. They'd split the list between them and reconvened at the counter with everything in under 20 minutes, which was fast enough that the harassed-looking shop owner looked faintly impressed. It was while they were waiting to pay that Harry felt it. Not the threads, though both were warm and present, Hermione's particularly vivid with her standing 3 feet away. Something else. A prickling along his spine, the specific sensation of eyes, but not hostile eyes. Curious ones. He turned. A red-headed family had come through the door, a mother and what appeared to be several sons of descending heights, the smallest around 11, the largest grown and clearly past school age. The mother had a warm, pleasant face and the slightly frantic air of someone managing a great many logistics at once. The boys were loud and cheerful and pushing at each other in the specific way brothers pushed at each other, which was a mode of interaction Harry found both baffling and faintly appealing. The smallest boy, the one his age, was looking at Harry. When Harry looked back, the boy's ears went red. "That's Ron Weasley," Hermione said quietly beside him. "The family's quite well known in the wizarding world. Old bloodlines, no money. The father works at the ministry. They're good people. I read about them in Wizarding Families of Britain, which is admittedly a secondary source, but," he's staring. "You're Harry Potter. Everyone's going to stare. I noticed. How do you want to handle it?" Harry looked at her sideways. "What do you mean, how do I want to handle it? You've been stared at in here since we came in. At Gringotts. Probably on the street. You're going to be famous in a way neither of us has had to deal with before. So, how do you want to handle it?" Nobody had ever asked him that before. Not about anything. How do you want to handle it, as if it were his choice and not something being done to him. He thought for exactly 2 seconds. "I'll be myself," he said. "If they want something I'm not, that's their problem." Hermione nodded as if this was the correct answer she'd been expecting. "They paid for their books." Outside, he paused and turned back. The Weasley boy was visible through the window, arguing with one of his brothers over something, ears still slightly pink. Harry thought about Fleur's letter. "Be careful who you tell." Then he thought about the quality of the red-headed family's loudness, which was the loudness of people who were genuinely comfortable with each other, which was a specific and rare thing. "He'll probably be on the Hogwarts Express," he said. "Almost certainly," Hermione agreed. They went to get their robes. Madame Malkin's was warm and smelled of fabric sizing and had a step stool on the fitting area that Harry stepped up onto while Madame Malkin moved around him with pins and murmured measurements. Hermione was in the chair across from the fitting area reading the Hogwarts, a history that she'd acquired at Flourish and Blotts and which she'd already started, apparently unable to wait until they were somewhere more comfortable. They were 3 minutes into the fitting when the door opened and a boy came in with 2 adults who announced themselves as his parents by the way they moved, slightly behind, slightly proprietary. The boy was pale and fine-featured and wearing the expression of someone who had grown up being told they were important and had accepted this assessment as simply factual. He stepped up onto the stool beside Harry. "Hogwarts," he said, by way of opening. "Yes," Harry said. "Me too. First year." He said it with the satisfaction of someone confirming an inevitable outcome. "Do you know your house yet?" "Not yet. I'll be Slytherin. Family tradition. My father was, and his father before him." "What's your name?" "Harry Potter." The boy's composure was good, Harry gave him that. The flicker of recognition was brief and well-controlled, lasting perhaps a second before the expression recalibrated into something more studied. "I'm Draco Malfoy." He said the name as if it came with footnotes. "Have you met your housemates yet? Any of them?" "I've met Crabbe and Goyle already, family friends." He glanced toward Hermione. "Is she with you?" Harry looked at Hermione. She was still reading, apparently unconcerned with the entire proceedings, though the slight angle of her posture told him she was listening. "Yes," he said. "What family?" "Granger," Hermione said, without looking up from her book. "Muggle-born." Malfoy's expression did something complicated. "Oh," he said. Harry looked at him steadily. "Is that going to be a problem?" It was the same tone he'd used on Vernon 3 years ago, flat, factual, not aggressive but also not soft. Malfoy looked at him with something that was trying to decide what it was and couldn't quite settle. "No," Malfoy said, after a moment. "Good." They finished their fittings in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. When Malfoy left with his parents, Harry stepped down off the stool and caught Hermione already looking at him over her book. "He'll be complicated," she said. "Most interesting people are." She turned a page. "I think that's the most optimistic thing I've heard you say about someone you just met." He held it together. "When he heard my name. Most people don't." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "You pay attention to a lot of things that other people don't." "You have to," Harry said simply, "when attention is what keeps you from getting hurt." Hermione closed her book. She looked at him with the direct, unguarded expression she sometimes had in her letters when she was choosing honesty over self-protection. "That's going to change," she said. "Hogwarts. It'll be different." "I know," he said. And he did. By mid-afternoon they'd gotten everything on both their lists and were sitting in a small cafe Hermione knew about, not a wizarding establishment, just an ordinary cafe on a side street with good tea and window seats and no one looking at Harry, and the letters from Fleur were on the table between them because Harry had brought them, had thought she should have the opportunity to know them the way he did. Hermione read them carefully. All of them. Harry drank his tea and watched the street outside. "She's very direct," Hermione said finally. "Yes. I find that slightly terrifying." "You'll find her slightly terrifying in general, probably. Then you'll find out why and stop being terrified." "What's the why?" Harry thought about it. "She's had to work harder than anyone around her to be seen as what she is instead of what she looks like. She learned to come at everything straight on because it's faster and it means people have to deal with what's real." Hermione looked at the letters again, then at Harry. "You understand her." "I understand some of it." "You understand the part about being seen wrong." Harry said nothing. "The bond," Hermione started, and then stopped. She'd been carefully scientific about the bond in their letters, approaching it as a phenomenon to be understood rather than a feeling to be discussed, and he recognized this as her version of Fleur's directness turned inward, a defense mechanism dressed as methodology. "What about it?" he said. "I've been trying to understand it academically because it's easier than." She stopped again. Picked up her tea. "The books say a triad resonance is unconditional. That it doesn't develop feelings. It identifies them. What was already there." "Yes. I read that too. So when I feel, when it's warm, the thread. That's not the bond creating something artificial. No. That's you." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "That's terrifying too." "Hermione." He waited until she looked at him. "You've been my closest friend for 3 years. That's real. What the bond did was make sure you knew I was out there." He paused. "I'm glad it did. I had nothing before your first letter." She was quiet for a long time. Rain had started on the window, soft and pattering, and the cafe was warm, and outside Diagon Alley was full of last-minute August shopping. Hermione put down her mug. "She should be here," she said. "Fleur? She should be here with us right now and she's not." And Hermione touched the place above her heart, briefly, the gesture Harry knew from 3 years of her describing it in letters. "The third thread is fainter. Physically. Because she's further away. But it's the same strength in the other sense." "I know. She knows too. I want to meet her." "You will. She'll find a way." He believed this completely, not because he was trying to be reassuring but because he'd read enough of Fleur's letters to know that finding a way was her fundamental mode of operation. Hermione nodded slowly. She picked up the last letter, the most recent one, the one from after Harry's Hogwarts letter, which she hadn't read yet, and unfolded it. Harry watched her read it. Watched the moment she got to the line about Apollin's concerns, the crossed-out line, the one that had started "My mother will not." He watched her understand it and the understanding move across her face. "Her mother is afraid," Hermione said. "Yes. Because she loves her." "Yes. The bond frightens people who don't understand it. The bond will frighten people who do understand it, Harry said. That's going to be the problem. Hermione refolded the letter with the same careful precision she'd used for all of them. She looked at him with something in her eyes that was decision. I've been doing research on the legal framework, she said. For the Triad Resonance. The Ministry has no explicit statute addressing it. There's an old Wiesengemot ordinance from 1643 that references it as a Category 7 magical phenomenon, meaning extraordinary, naturally occurring, and outside interference, Hermione. Yes. We're 11. We have time. I know. I'm just, she smiled, slightly rueful. Preparing. I know. I like that you prepare. He stood and picked up his bag. Come on. I want to show you something before Petunia comes back for me. He took her to the mouth of the alley, where the bricks opened onto Charing Cross Road, and they stood just inside the passage looking out at London in the rain and the ordinary magic of it, black cabs and double-deckers and people in coats and a city that had no idea what was happening in the alley just behind this wall. It was, Harry thought, a useful reminder. The world was large and most of it was operating on completely different information, and that was fine. He didn't need the world to know. Next time, Hermione said beside him, Fleur will be here. Next time, he agreed. The thread that pointed toward France warmed gently in his chest, like an answer to something he hadn't quite asked. That evening, back in the cupboard under the stairs, Harry wrote a letter. Not to Hermione, she was taking the train home and he'd see her in 3 weeks on platform 9 3/4. To Fleur. We went today. Diagon Alley. I met her. You're right that she's extraordinary, I knew that from the letters, but in person it's different. The thread was almost too strong at first, being that close, I nearly said something embarrassing. She catalogued it immediately and told me about it, and that made it better. She asked about you. Said you should have been there. I think she meant it the same way I mean it, not as criticism, just as fact. The three of us in the same place is going to be something else entirely. I wanted you to know that I'm not going in alone. Neither is she. I won't pretend that fixes the distance, but I wanted to tell you anyway. Your mother is frightened of the bond. I understand that. I'm not going to tell you not to be angry about it because you're allowed to be angry. But she's trying to protect you with the tools she has. That's not nothing, even when it's also not enough. September 1st. Hogwarts. I'll write when I'm there. The bond will be quieter at this distance, but it won't be gone. It's never gone. Harry, he let the letter go. Felt it leave. Felt the thread's warm pulse of acknowledgement from across the channel. Then he lay back, pressed his father's sealed letter against his chest without opening it because it wasn't time yet, not yet, and looked at the familiar wood grain above him. In 3 weeks he would leave this cupboard for the last time. He would not look back. Something was ending, which was fine, because something was beginning, and what was beginning was his. He was 11 years old and already knew exactly who he was. Everything else was just details. Chapter 3, the name of what it is. The Hogwarts Express left at 11 o'clock and Harry was on the platform at 10:15, which gave him 45 minutes of standing with a trolley and an owl in a cage and watching the wizarding world arrange itself around him. Hedwig, he'd named her that morning, the name arriving the moment he'd looked at her in Aesop's Owl Emporium, absolute and obvious, regarded the platform chaos with the dignified patience of someone who had agreed to tolerate a great deal on behalf of someone she'd decided to trust. Hermione arrived at 10:30 with both parents in tow, carrying more books than strictly fit into a standard school trunk by what Harry suspected was a charm she'd worked out on her own from the library books, because she'd mentioned in passing that her trunk was spatially optimized and hadn't elaborated. Her parents were pleasant, slightly dazed people who looked at everything on the platform with the polite bewilderment of tourists in a country whose customs they hadn't had time to read about. Her father shook Harry's hand with real warmth. Her mother looked at Harry, then at Hermione, then back at Harry, with the expression of someone who had been told something that hadn't quite made sense until this moment. "So you're Harry," she said. "Yes. Hermione's mentioned you. Good things, I hope." Mrs. Granger smiled. "She mentioned you very specifically. That was the thing." She said it with the comfortable directness of a woman who'd raised a daughter who didn't do anything accidentally. Hermione, beside him, went slightly pink. They found a compartment toward the middle of the train and loaded everything and said goodbye to the Grangers on the platform, and Harry watched Hermione hug her mother through the window with the slightly self-conscious intensity of someone who understood on an intellectual level that leaving was normal but felt it physically as a loss anyway. He felt the thread between them steady and constant, warmer for the proximity, and turned away to give her the moment. The Weasley boy knocked on their compartment door 10 minutes after the train left the station. He was on his own, which suggested he'd gotten separated from his brothers or simply decided to look for other first years, and he stood in the doorway with an expression of sociable uncertainty that Harry found genuinely appealing. "Everywhere else is full," Ron Weasley said. "Or full of horrible people. Is it all right if I—" "Yes," Harry and Hermione said simultaneously. Ron sat down, looked between them with mild curiosity, and produced a set of chocolate frogs from his pocket. "Want one? I've got about 12. My mum thinks train journeys require enormous amounts of food." He said this with the affectionate resignation of someone who had spent 11 years being overfed by someone who expressed love through sandwiches. Harry found, over the next 3 hours, that Ron Weasley was exactly what he'd appeared to be through the window at Flourish and Blotts, a person without a false layer, which was rarer than it sounded. He said what he thought, laughed easily, was somewhat awed by Harry in a way he was clearly trying to manage through friendly conversation rather than staring, and had strong opinions about Quidditch that he delivered with the passionate authority of someone who'd been forming them since birth. He was perceptive in a way he didn't seem to fully know about yet. He caught things in conversation that the words weren't quite saying, and then he moved past them in a way that suggested he'd filed them but wasn't going to make anyone uncomfortable by acknowledging them. He noticed the threads. Not what they were, but the something of them. He looked at Harry and then at Hermione with a slight tilt to his head about 20 minutes in, and said, "You two have known each other a while," and when they said not exactly, he nodded slowly as if this had confirmed something rather than contradicted it. When the trolley came and Hermione bought nothing and Harry bought a selection of everything he hadn't tried and they ate through it while Ron narrated the chocolate frog cards, it felt, completely naturally, without effort or negotiation, like a thing that had always been happening. "What house do you think you'll get?" Ron asked. "Gryffindor," Hermione said, with the precision of someone who had evaluated all the houses empirically and reached a conclusion. "Same," Ron said. "Has to be. All my family's been Gryffindor." "What about you, Harry?" Harry looked out the window at the passing landscape, Scotland now, the mountains beginning, the light going gold in the late afternoon. "Wherever it puts me," he said. Ron frowned. "You don't have a preference?" "I have preferences about other things." He felt the thread that pointed toward France warm briefly, independently of anything. Fleur thinking of him, he'd learned to read these pulses. The house isn't one of them. The sorting was what it was. The entrance hall was vast and candlelit and full of ghosts, and Harry stood with the other first years and looked at all of it with the composed attention he brought to new environments, cataloging. The ceiling was spelled to show the sky outside, which was cloudy. The tables were full of older students who were looking at the incoming first years with the evaluating curiosity of people who understood that this cohort would be their schoolmates for 7 years. He felt the stares when his name was called. He'd been feeling them all evening, the ripple that moved through a room when people put together the scar and the name and the story. He walked to the stool and sat down and the hat was placed on his head and he sat in the odd private dark of it. The hat said, into his mind, with the tone of someone settling into a conversation they'd been looking forward to, "Well, this is unusual." Harry waited. 3 threads. "The bond's already formed, hasn't it?" "Partial, but real." I've been placing students for 900 years and I've seen a resonance bond twice. Never a triad. This is, yes. Very interesting. A pause. You do well anywhere, you know. You're aware of that. The house doesn't matter to me, Harry thought back. Put me where I'll be most useful. Most useful to what? Whatever's coming. And to them. The hat was quiet for 3 seconds, which felt like longer. Then it said, with something that might have been satisfaction, Gryffindor. The table erupted. He walked to it, sat down, and a red-headed boy 2 years above him, a prefect, by the badge, clapped him on the shoulder and said something welcoming that Harry didn't quite catch because Hermione was being called next and he was watching. She sat under the hat for precisely 4 seconds. It shouted Gryffindor before she'd finished sitting down, with the air of something that had seen her coming from a long way off. She came and sat beside him. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The thread between them was steady and close and warm, and that was enough. The first week of Hogwarts was, in the aggregate, exactly what Harry had expected and completely different from what he'd expected simultaneously, which was a paradox he suspected was specific to the place. He was excellent at most subjects before he'd done the assigned reading, which he'd done before arriving anyway, which meant the classes were largely revision for him and genuinely new territory at the same time because theory from books and practice with actual magic were so different as to barely qualify as the same subject. Hermione was the same, with the additional quality of being visibly, physically pleased by every piece of new information, which Harry found consistently entertaining. Ron was not as strong academically but had an instinctive grasp of magical theory when it was explained in practical terms, and the 3 of them had fallen into a study dynamic by Thursday of the first week that felt like they'd been doing it for years, which in some ways they had. Professors noticed Harry. This was inevitable. Dumbledore noticed him first, in the way that someone notices a thing they've been waiting for. Harry saw it at the sorting feast, a long look from the end of the staff table that was fond and calculating in equal measure. Professor McGonagall was brisk and fair and clearly liked him without intending to show it. Professor Flitwick was delighted by him. Professor Quirrell was nervous. Professor Snape hated him on sight. Harry's first potions class ran as follows. Snape asked him a series of questions about potion ingredients that were specifically designed to humiliate, each one more obscure than the last. Harry answered every single one correctly, calmly, from the library reading he'd done over the summer, and watched Snape's expression move through surprise and land on something cold and recalibrating. The class watched with the held-breath tension of spectators at something that might go several ways. 5 points to Gryffindor, Snape said finally, as if the words were costing him something. Thank you, Professor, Harry said. Snape looked at him for a long moment, dark eyes doing something complicated, and moved on. Harry returned to his ingredient preparation. Hermione, beside him, exhaled quietly. He was trying to embarrass you, she murmured. I know. You weren't embarrassed. I knew the answers. He paused. He's angry about something that isn't me. It just has my face on it. Hermione looked at him sideways. The book's about your parents, not now, he said quietly. Not distressed. Just not now. She nodded and let it go, which was one of the things he valued most about her. The letter from Fleur arrived 10 days into term, delivered not by the school owls but by a sleek French bird that drew every eye in the great hall. Harry felt the thread warm a full minute before the owl arrived, which was enough time to put down his fork and be ready. He took the letter, stroked the owl's head with a brief, genuine thanks, and tucked it into his robes to read privately. He read it in the Gryffindor common room after dinner, sitting in a chair by the fire while Hermione read beside him and Ron fell asleep over a chessboard. Harry, Beauxbatons is everything I expected and slightly less than I needed, which is a sentence I will explain. The classes are excellent. The school is beautiful. My Vila blood is more visible here than anywhere I've been before because everyone at Beauxbatons is paying so much attention to presentation that the smallest things become enormous. 3 girls in my dormitory have stopped talking to me because I am better at charms than them. One boy has sent me 5 letters in 10 days that do not mention my personality once. I am fine. I am, in general, always fine, because I have learned to be. The reason I am writing with some urgency, there is a professor here. Beauxbatons has a history professor who specializes in bond magic, Professor Lebrun, who is 73 and has the look of someone who has read everything ever written. My mother spoke with him last spring about what I had felt that August, before she decided to hope it would go away. He didn't tell her that. He told her what it was and she chose not to tell me, which I am choosing not to be angry about because it would take energy I need elsewhere. I went to see him myself last week. I told him what I felt in 1988, the nature of the threads, the letters, the warmth of proximity, everything. He was quiet for a very long time and then he said, "Mademoiselle Delacour, you are describing a triad resonance in its early formation. I have studied 3 documented historical instances. I have never expected to see one in my lifetime." He gave me 4 books. I've read all 4. I'll summarize the important parts, because I know Hermione will want the sources and you'll want the conclusions, so I'm writing both. A triad resonance is not a bond that is formed. It is a bond that is recognized. 3 magical cores of extraordinary and specific compatibility, complementary frequencies, the texts say, though the metaphysics are more complex than that word makes them sound, locate each other across whatever distance separates them when one of the 3 does something powerful enough to transmit. The recognition is mutual and simultaneous. It has always, in every documented case, been permanent. Professor Lebrun says no intervention has ever successfully severed one. Not potions, not counter curses, not ritual unbinding. 3 witches attempted it on the 1743 triad and all 3 ended up in St. Mungo's Forerunner with magical exhaustion so severe 2 of them lost their powers temporarily. The bond doesn't fight back. It simply is what it is, the way gravity is what it is, and trying to sever it is like trying to sever the relationship between a planet and its sun. He also said something I'm still thinking about. He said, the bond identifies what is already true. The question is never whether to accept the bond. The question is whether you accept yourselves. I don't fully understand that yet. But I think I will. Write back. Tell me about Hogwarts. Tell me about Hermione. Tell me about yourself, not events. I want to know how you are. Fleur Harry read it twice. Then he said, quietly, Hermione. She looked up from her book. You'll want to read this. He handed it across. She read it with the focused intensity she brought to anything worth reading, which was most things, and when she finished she was quiet for a long moment with her hands flat on the letter. A triad resonance, she said. You already knew the name. I knew the name. Hearing it confirmed is different. She looked at the fire. Professor Lebrun. I want his sources. I'll ask Fleur in my reply. Ask her what the professor meant. About accepting ourselves. I think I already know what he meant. Hermione looked at him. What? The bond didn't create anything. It found things that were real. So the question isn't whether we trust the bond, it's whether we trust what's real. He paused. Which is harder? She was quiet for a moment. Ron snored gently over the chessboard. I trust you, Hermione said, and looked slightly surprised to hear herself say it that plainly, and then looked like someone who had decided, just now, to stop being surprised by plain truths. I've trusted you since your first letter. That was always real. I know, Harry said. Same. The news reached Dumbledore on a Wednesday in mid-October. Harry knew this because he could read a room, and when he sat down at the Gryffindor table for breakfast on Thursday, the headmaster's gaze landed on him with a quality it hadn't had before, still fond, still warm, but with a new layer of consideration underneath, like a calculation being revised. Harry returned the look evenly, ate his toast, and said nothing. McGonagall came to the Gryffindor table at 8:15. "Mr. Potter. After your last class today, the headmaster would like a word." "All right," Harry said. "May I ask what it's about?" She looked at him with the slight pause of someone deciding how much to say. "He'll explain." Harry nodded. Beside him, Hermione had gone very still with her pumpkin juice in one hand. "It'll be fine," he said. "You don't know that." "Hermione." He waited. "When have I not been able to handle something?" She thought about it genuinely rather than offering reflexive reassurance. "Never," she admitted. "But Dumbledore is smart, powerful, and operating on a plan I haven't been told about." "I know." He picked up his toast again. "That's fine. He can have his plan. It doesn't require my participation to exist." Dumbledore's office was the most interesting room Harry had ever been in, which was saying something given that he'd been in every interesting room at Hogwarts that was accessible to a first-year student, and he'd been at Hogwarts for 6 weeks. It was circular and full of silvery instruments doing things he didn't have names for yet, and portraits of previous headmasters napped and watched alternately, and a phoenix on a perch near the window regarded him with the orange fire of its gaze. Harry looked at the phoenix. The phoenix looked at Harry. Something passed between them in the specific register of one warm-blooded creature acknowledging another. "Fawkes likes you," Dumbledore said, settling behind his desk with the ease of someone who had nowhere more important to be and no intention of pretending otherwise. "I like him," Harry said. Dumbledore smiled, genuinely, and Harry filed this as data point 1, the smile was real, and folded his hands on the desk. He was a tall, old man with a long beard and half-moon spectacles and the aura of someone who had been in the room before any conversation in it started. His eyes, behind the spectacles, were a very specific shade of blue that reminded Harry, unexpectedly, of Fleur's descriptions of her grandmother. "I expect you know why I wanted to speak with you," Dumbledore said. "You've heard about the bond," Harry said. "I have." A slight pause. "You know what it is?" "A Triad Resonance. 3 magical cores, mine, Hermione Granger's, and Fleur Delacour's. Formed on the 7th of August, 1988, when I lost control of a magical pulse in Surrey." He said it factually, without apology or drama. "It's permanent. No intervention has successfully severed one. Professor Lebrun at Beauxbatons confirmed it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and Harry could see something happening behind the blue eyes, not surprise, exactly. More like the recalibration of someone who had expected to be delivering news and was adjusting to the discovery that the news had already been received. "You've done a great deal of research." "Hermione did the research. I read her research. Fleur did her own research. We compared notes." He paused. "We've been writing to each other for 3 years. "Yes. I'd heard something of that." Another pause. "Harry, may I call you Harry? I want to be candid with you." "I'd appreciate that. The bond concerns me. Not because I doubt its nature, what Professor Lebrun has confirmed aligns with what I know of resonance bonds. But because of what it means for you, specifically, given what I believe lies ahead of you." Harry met his gaze. "What do you believe lies ahead of me?" Dumbledore's expression shifted into something that was genuinely careful rather than performatively careful, which was a real distinction, and Harry noted it. "I believe there is a darkness that has not fully left the world. I believe it is connected to what happened to your parents. And I believe that when it returns, and I do believe it will return, you will be at the center of it." Harry took this in. He'd known pieces of it, the books, the stares, the whispers he caught in corridors. He hadn't known it stated plainly, and he found that he preferred it this way. "All right," he said. Dumbledore blinked. "All right? I'd rather know." He looked at the phoenix again. How does the bond change anything? A triad bond, especially an unregistered one, with a foreign national, will draw attention from people who cannot be trusted with it. The Ministry of Magic has certain factions who view extraordinary magical phenomena with suspicion. And the bond makes you, all three of you, more powerful together than apart. That makes people afraid. Good, Harry said. The word landed in the room with a certain weight. Dumbledore looked at him over the spectacles. I'm serious, Harry said. If it makes people afraid, it's because they're considering interference, and if it makes interference harder, that's a feature. Not a problem. He paused. What was it you were actually going to suggest? A very long pause. Then, to Dumbledore's credit, a small, genuine laugh. I was going to suggest discretion. I'm not going to hide what I am, Harry said. Not aggressive. Simply settled. If that's what you mean. I didn't say hide, you said discretion, which in my experience generally means making other people comfortable with something by making it smaller. He kept his voice even. I'm not going to do that. If the bond is what the research says it is, then it's not dangerous and it doesn't need managing, and anyone who says it does is protecting something other than my welfare. He stood. I appreciate you telling me what's coming. I mean that. Can I ask you something in return? Dumbledore nodded, looking at him with an expression that had set aside all its calculations and was simply curious. My parents. Do you know the full story? A long pause. Some of it. When you're ready to tell me, I'd like to hear it. He left the office. Fawkes made a soft sound behind him as he went, low and melodic, like the opening note of something long. The first attempt to sever the bond happened on a Saturday in November. Harry hadn't been informed it was coming. He suspected nobody had thought to inform him because nobody had thought it was necessary to inform him, which said something worth knowing about how certain parties viewed his role in his own life. He was in the library with Hermione working through a transfiguration problem when it happened, a sudden, sharp contraction in the thread connecting him to Hermione that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then released, leaving a bright, angry warmth behind like sunburn. Hermione made a short, involuntary sound and pressed her hand to her chest. What was that? Ron said, looking up from the chess problem he'd been working on across the table. Harry was already standing. Someone tried to do something to the bond. He looked at Hermione. She was breathing normally, color back in her face, but her eyes were hot. I felt it, she said. From outside. Something, trying to reach in and cut. Are you hurt? No. She looked at her own hands with the expression of someone checking for damage and finding none. No, it pushed back. It pushed back hard. Whoever that was, she looked up. They're hurt. They found out on Monday. Professor Marchbanks, not a Hogwarts teacher but an examiner who had been on site for an assessment of the school's wards, had attempted a ritual unbinding on Saturday afternoon from a classroom on the 3rd floor that she'd borrowed under the guise of private paperwork. She was currently in the hospital wing with her wand hand bandaged and the expression of someone who had underestimated something fundamental about the nature of the universe. Madame Pomfrey wouldn't let Harry in to see her. He didn't need to. He stood in the corridor outside the hospital wing and thought about what Fleur had written, the bond doesn't fight back. It simply is what it is, the way gravity is what it is, and trying to sever it is like trying to sever the relationship between a planet and its sun, and thought that Professor Lebrun had been precise in his metaphors. He went back to the library and wrote to Fleur. Someone tried. A ministry examiner. She's in the hospital wing. The bond didn't do anything except refuse, and the refusal was enough. I'm not angry. I'm practical about it. This will happen again, probably with more official backing. I want us to be ready. What do you know about the legal standing of a documented Triad Resonance? Hermione is already researching, but French law might have different precedents. How are you? not events. How are you? Harry. Her reply came 2 days later, shorter and more direct than usual, which he'd learned meant she was feeling something precisely rather than thinking around it. The legal standing is this: there is no law in France, Britain, or the ICW Charter that permits forced dissolution of a naturally occurring magical bond. What they can do, and what I suspect they will try, is legislate it. Create new law. That takes time and requires a majority, and we will have the time to prepare if we move first. Professor Lebrun is writing a formal paper for the International Magical Congress. I asked him to. He said he'd been planning to write it for 30 years and was grateful for the impetus. As for how I am impatient. The distance is, it is fine. I have learned to be fine with distances. But the thread to you both has been louder since November, since the attempt, as if the bond is accounting for having been challenged. It is warm all the time now, even at night. I am not complaining. I thought you should know. 7 months until I'll be in England for the tournament. My mother has finally stopped arguing and started asking practical questions instead, which is her version of accepting something. I will come early if I can manage it. I will see you before September if it takes magic I haven't invented yet. I am well, Harry. I am better when I write to you. That is how I am. Harry read this letter by the fire in the Gryffindor common room, late on a Wednesday night when everyone else had gone to bed. He held it in both hands and felt the French thread warm in his chest, steady and insistent. He thought about the phrase "better when I write to you" and the fact that she'd chosen to write it, which from Fleur meant something specific and weighted and deliberate. He wrote back immediately, 3 lines, "I know. Same. We'll be in the same place eventually, and when we are, the people who are afraid of this bond will understand exactly why they should have been. Stay safe." Harry. He let it go into the dark and felt it arrive across the water, felt the thread warm in response, felt Hermione's thread warm too as if it were picking up on the frequency, and for a moment all 3 of them were connected, awake at different hours in different countries, alive and real and entirely beyond the reach of anyone who'd thought to unravel them. He went to bed. He slept well, the way he always slept when the threads were warm, deeply and without interruption, like a compass that had found its direction and had no further need for spinning. December brought snow and the end-of-term exams, which Harry and Hermione sailed through with the ease of people who had been doing the work since August, and Ron struggled through with more success than he expected because Harry and Hermione had been drilling him relentlessly for 2 weeks. On the last night before the holidays, the 3 of them sat in the common room by the fire and ate chocolate that Molly Weasley had sent in a package large enough to constitute a structural hazard, and Ron talked about the burrow and Harry watched the fire and Hermione read Magical Bonds Through the Ages, Volume 2, which she'd gotten from the restricted section via a teacher's note. She'd talked Professor Flitwick into signing by asking him very specific questions about the subject until he'd agreed, more to satisfy his own curiosity than hers. "You know," Ron said, eating a chocolate frog and studying the card, "Dumbledore's on this card. It says he defeated Grindelwald in 1945. He looked at Harry. "Did he say anything when you met with him? About, any of it?" "He said something's coming," Harry said. Ron nodded slowly, unsurprised in the way people who grew up in magical families were unsurprised by the existence of darkness in the world. "Dad says the same thing sometimes." "Doesn't say what?" "Just, that things aren't settled." "They're not," Harry agreed. "And the bond thing?" Ron looked between them with his habitual directness. He'd known about the bond, broadly, not specifically, since about week 3, when Harry had decided that knowing Ron's character was sufficient basis for telling him, and he'd reacted to the information with a kind of practical, unsentimental acceptance that Harry had found deeply refreshing. Marchbanks. That was about the bond? Yes. Ron ate another chocolate. "Stupid thing to try," he said, with the authority of someone who'd grown up around magic enough to understand its rules. "You can't unbind something like that. Even I know that." Apparently she didn't, Hermione said without looking up. Well, she does now. Harry laughed, a short, genuine one. Ron grinned. Hermione's mouth curved without her lifting her eyes from the page. Outside, snow was falling on the castle and Hogwarts was quiet in the way it got in December, settling into itself, old stones and old magic breathing in the winter dark. Harry felt both threads warm, Hermione beside him, Fleur across the channel somewhere, probably asleep by now, probably aware of him anyway because the bond was like that, it didn't require consciousness to operate. He felt the specific weight of the year behind him, the cupboard, Diagon Alley, Hermione's face outside Gringotts, Dumbledore's office, the sharp contraction in November that had resolved immediately into warmth. 12 years old next July. First year almost done. The world was rearranging itself around what he was, and he was letting it, and everything it tried to throw at what he'd already built simply slid off. He thought about Fleur's letter. I will see you before September if it takes magic I haven't invented yet. He believed her completely. Chapter 4, The Trial. The Ministry of Magic summoned Harry Potter on a Tuesday in October of his second year, which was, as Hermione pointed out with the controlled fury of someone who had strong feelings about procedural law, completely illegal. You're 12, she said, pacing the length of the Gryffindor common room with a parchment she'd been annotating for the past 2 hours clutched in one hand. The Wisengamot Procedural Charter of 1847 requires that a minor cannot be compelled to attend a hearing without a magical guardian present and 3 weeks written notice. They gave you 8 days. They gave us 8 days, the summons includes me, which is arguably worse because I'm Muggle-born and there are specific protections, Hermione. I'm not done. I know. Keep going. She looked at him, momentarily thrown by the encouragement, and then kept going. The summons cites the Extraordinary Bonds Restriction Act, which doesn't exist. I checked. There is no such act. They are citing legislation that has not been written yet to justify a hearing about something that has no legal standing as a violation. Which means, they're making it up as they go, Ron said from the armchair, where he'd been following this with the expression of someone watching a very complicated match with a great deal riding on it. They're attempting to create precedent, Hermione corrected. If Harry goes to this hearing and doesn't contest the premise, the Wisengamot can use the record of the hearing itself as evidence that the authority existed. That's how they'll do it. Not with a proper law, with administrative capture. Harry looked at her. She was genuinely brilliant and he was, not for the first time, specifically grateful that the bond had found her. What do I do? She stopped pacing. You go. You contest every single thing. You make them justify every premise before you answer any question. She paused. And you take someone who knows magical law. Professor Dumbledore, no. She said it immediately. Dumbledore has his own interest in how this resolves. I don't trust him to argue your position rather than his. Harry nodded. He'd reached the same conclusion independently. Fleur wrote that her mother knows a wizarding solicitor in Paris. Someone who worked ICW cases. Hermione's eyes sharpened. Fleur's coming? She wrote yesterday. She's coming. The specific quality of Hermione's silence lasted about 2 seconds. How? She didn't specify. She said she'd be in London by the 30th. The hearing was scheduled for November 1st. She said her mother is coming with her. Her mother, Hermione processed this. Apollon Delacour is coming to the Ministry of Magic. Yes. To fight for the bond. I know. Hermione sat down in the chair across from Ron, which was the chair she sat in when she was done pacing and had moved into serious planning mode. When Fleur arrives, she said, I need 2 hours with her and her mother's solicitor before the hearing. And I need to brief the solicitor on the procedural irregularities, so he, or she, is ready to raise them at the opening. She said his name is Maître Fontaine. He's 70 and has never lost an ICW case. Perfect. She looked back at her annotated parchment. I need to write 4 more pages tonight. I know, Harry said. I'll bring you tea. Thank you. She was already writing. Ron looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had genuinely accepted the specific nature of this friendship and had made peace with the fact that his role in extraordinary events was frequently supportive rather than central, and who was comfortable enough in his own skin to be fine with that. I'll come with you to the ministry. You don't have to. Mate. Ron's voice was flat with sincerity. Obviously I'm coming. Fleur arrived in London on October 29th. Harry felt it when her thread shifted, not distance closing but dimension changing, the difference between the bond carrying across open water and the bond carrying across land, a warmth that went from diffuse to directional in the way a sound went from ambient to present. He was in charms when it happened, and he kept his hands steady on his practice wand and his expression neutral and finished the levitation exercise and wrote down the charm notation and waited until the bell rang before he exhaled. She was in London. For the first time, she was on the same island. He wrote her that night, a short letter, I can feel you from here. First time. How are you? Her reply came in 20 minutes, I know. I felt you from Dover. It is, a gap, then, it is not what I expected. How it would feel. To be close. Write more. Then, a second line she'd apparently added after, the solicitor arrives tomorrow morning. I have notes for Hermione. My mother says hello and also that you should eat properly because she has decided you look too thin based on your Hogwarts photograph, which appeared in the French wizarding press last year. You are apparently well known here too. Harry read this twice. The part about Dover stayed with him. I felt you from Dover. He pressed his hand to his chest, felt both threads, and thought about what it would feel like to stand in the same room as all 3 points of the bond simultaneously. He'd been thinking about it for 3 years and now it was 2 days away and the thought sat in him with a particular quality, not nervousness, not exactly. Something more like the feeling just before you opened a letter you'd been waiting for. She was in the ministry atrium with her mother when they arrived, and Harry saw her before she saw him. Fleur Delacour was taller than he'd imagined and the same as he'd imagined simultaneously, which was a specific paradox of meeting someone you'd known in letters. She was 17 now, they'd been writing since she was 11, and there was nothing ambiguous about the Vila heritage in her bearing, the way she stood in the ministry atrium as if it had been arranged specifically for her arrival. Silver blonde hair, sharp blue eyes that were currently scanning the atrium with the focused assessment of someone evaluating terrain. Beside her was Apollon Delacour, who was clearly her mother and possessed the same quality of complete comfort in her own presence, and beside Apollon was a small, very upright man in French wizarding robes who carried a briefcase with the confidence of someone who considered it a weapon. Then Fleur's gaze found him and everything that had been calculated in her expression dropped away entirely. It was only for a second. Then she put it back, perfectly arranged, and walked toward him, and he walked toward her, and when they were 5 feet apart both of them stopped because the thread between them had gone from warm to incandescent and they were both clearly feeling it, standing in the ministry atrium at 9 in the morning, and it was, a lot. Hello, he said. Hello, she said, in French, then caught herself and said it again in English, which was flawless. She'd been practicing, he could tell, the same way he'd been practicing French. How was Dover, he said. Something flickered across her face, the equivalent, he'd learned to read from her letters, of a smile she'd decided not to perform but meant anyway. Overwhelming, she said. You should warn people before the bond does whatever it does at close range. I didn't know it would do that. I've never been that close before. Neither have I. Her eyes were very direct. It is good to finally meet you. It's good to meet you, he said, and meant it in a way that the words weren't quite large enough to contain. Hermione arrived from behind Harry, slightly breathless from having run from the floor point where they'd separated because she'd misjudged the step and stumbled, and when Fleur looked at her, her expression did something different again, recognition of a specific kind, the way you recognized someone you'd been talking to through a door and were now meeting through an open one. Hermione, Fleur said. Fleur. Hermione straightened her robes. She extended her hand with the precision of someone who had decided the handshake was the right register for this first moment. Fleur took it, held it for a moment longer than the handshake required, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with Harry and everything to do with 3 years of letters and the specific experience of two people who'd never met but had already trusted each other with real things. "You're going to brief Maître Fontaine," Fleur said. "I have 12 pages of notes. He'll want 15. I have 12 finished. I can write 3 more in the next 2 hours." "Good." A pause. Then, quieter, "I'm glad you're both here." "I have been, it is better, being here." "The threads are, all 3 together," Hermione said. "Yes." Harry looked between them. He thought, not for the first time, that the bond had been extraordinarily specific in what it had found, and that the word complementary from the texts was doing a great deal of work on behalf of something more precise. They were not 3 similar people. They were 3 people who fit. Apollon Delacour had been watching this from 4 feet away with an expression Harry hadn't expected. He'd anticipated wariness. Fleur's letters had described her mother's concerns in enough detail that he'd built a mental image of a woman braced against an outcome. What he saw instead was someone who had been braced and had, in the last 30 seconds, let go of the bracing because the thing she'd been afraid of had arrived and turned out to be nothing like what she'd feared. She looked at Harry for a long moment. Then she said, in lightly accented English, "You are smaller than I expected. I've been told. You also look too thin. I've been told that too. Just this morning." The corner of her mouth moved. "Maître Fontaine," she said, turning to the small upright man, "my daughter's bondmates. The brief will be given by Miss Granger. She has 12 pages and will apparently have 15 by the time the hearing starts." Maître Fontaine looked at Hermione with the evaluating squint of someone who had processed many briefs in his long career and had opinions about their quality. 12 pages, he said. "What are the procedural grounds?" Hermione launched into it immediately, and Harry watched Fontaine's squint shift, incrementally but clearly, from evaluation to something approaching approval, and thought that this was already going better than anyone at the ministry had anticipated. The Wisengamot chamber was exactly as oppressive as it had been designed to be. Harry sat in the chair in the center, the one with the chains, which had attempted to bind his wrists and which he'd looked at with such flat disinterest that they'd settled back without completing the motion, as if reconsidering, and looked at the banks of seats arranged in a horseshoe above him and felt, entirely, nothing like intimidated. The chamber was perhaps 3/4 full. At the minister's bench sat Cornelius Fudge, who had the specific quality of a man who had been important for long enough that he'd forgotten importance was contingent. Beside him, Dolores Umbridge occupied her seat with the particular stillness of a cat that had arranged itself in a warm spot and intended to stay there indefinitely. She was wearing pink robes and a smile that Harry clocked immediately as the smile of someone who had planned a great deal and was looking forward to executing the plan. He'd read about Umbridge. Hermione had given him a summary, 3 pages, succinct, brutal in its assessment. She was the architect of the Extraordinary Bonds Restriction Act that didn't exist yet but that Fudge had been persuaded to treat as existing. She was the person who had drafted the summons. She wanted the bond declared a dark object, the Triad broken by ministry order, and Harry Potter resituated as a ward of the ministry, which would give the ministry guardianship over decisions about his life and his magic. That last part was what Hermione had underlined 3 times in red ink. Maître Fontaine sat to Harry's left. Apollon Delacour sat behind them in the gallery, Fleur beside her, both of them in the seats allocated for magical witnesses. Hermione was in the witness section as well, with Ron, who had come as promised and was sitting with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had been raised by Molly Weasley and knew exactly what it looked like when an authority was behaving badly. Dumbledore was also present, in his capacity as Supreme Mugwump. He sat at the senior judge's bench with his hands folded and his expression pleasantly neutral, and when Harry glanced at him, the headmaster gave a slight nod that could have meant several different things and which Harry did not attempt to interpret. Fudge opened the hearing. He had the pompous rhythm of a man who had written his opening remarks twice and was delivering them as if they were spontaneous. The Triad Resonance was described as a potentially coercive magical phenomenon. The Extraordinary Bonds Restriction Act was cited as authority. Harry's heritage, meaning his fame, his connection to Voldemort, the scar, was referenced as a reason why his welfare required ministry oversight. Harry let him finish. Maître Fontaine rose. "Madam Chief Witch," he said, addressing the woman in the center of the senior bench rather than Fudge, because the Chief Witch was Amelia Bones and she was not the same as Fudge, "I raise a preliminary objection. The summons issued to my client cites the Extraordinary Bonds Restriction Act of 1992. For the benefit of the record, could the presiding minister indicate when this act was passed, by what majority, and where it appears in the Register of Wizarding Law?" Fudge opened his mouth. Closed it. Umbridge said, in the sweet, terribly patient voice she used for making things sound reasonable, "The act is in the process of formal codification, Madam," Fontaine said, very quietly, "either the act exists or it does not. If it does not exist, this hearing has no legal premise and no authority to compel my client's attendance." He paused precisely 1 second. "I would ask the Chief Witch to rule on whether we may proceed." Amelia Bones had sharp eyes behind square spectacles and the expression of someone who was not afraid of inconvenient rulings. She looked at Fudge. She looked at Umbridge. She said, "The objection is noted. The act does not currently appear in the register. Proceed on existing law, Minister." Fudge's face had gone a complicated shade of pink. Harry watched this from the chair in the center of the chamber and felt the thread to Fleur briefly brighten. She was watching from the gallery and she'd registered the same thing he'd registered, which was that Fontaine had just removed the entire legal foundation of the hearing before it had properly started. Now they had to figure out what it would run on instead. Umbridge spoke for 20 minutes. She was, Harry acknowledged with genuine reluctant professionalism, very good at making things that weren't evidence sound like evidence. She described the Triad Resonance as of uncertain provenance. She described Fleur Delacour as a foreign national with a heritage known to include coercive magical traits, meaning the Vila blood, without using the word Vila. She described Hermione Granger as potentially the most vulnerable party, being Muggle-born and therefore less equipped to evaluate her own magical experiences. She described Harry as the primary locus of an untested and unregistered phenomenon, whose welfare the Ministry had an obligation to assess. Every sentence was careful. Every sentence sounded almost reasonable if you weren't paying very close attention to what it was actually saying. "Mr. Potter," she said finally, turning to him with the sweet smile that never touched her eyes. "Can you describe when you first became aware of this bond?" Harry looked at her. August 7, 1988. I was 8 years old. I was living in a cupboard under the stairs at my aunt and uncle's house and my uncle was speaking to me in a way that, he stopped, considered. In a way that was not appropriate for how you speak to a child. The magic in me responded to that, and the pulse was the result. Complete silence in the chamber. He hadn't planned to say the cupboard part. He'd simply decided, in the moment of speaking, that honesty without softening was more powerful than anything that could be prepared. He felt Hermione's thread go sharp and hot, not distress, but the specific feeling she had when she was confronting something true that made her angry. He felt Fleur's thread go very still. Fudge was looking at his papers. "A cupboard," Amelia Bones said, from the senior bench. "Not a question. Something much more flat than a question." "Yes," Harry said. "The Ministry addressed my letters there, so they were aware of my living arrangements. I mention it because the claim that the Ministry is concerned with my welfare is contextually interesting." Several members of the Wisengamot were not looking at Fudge. Several were looking very directly at Fudge. Umbridge pivoted smoothly. "Be that as it may, the bond itself. Do you claim it is natural? Organic? Professor Lebrun of Beauxbatons has formally documented it as a Triad Resonance, Harry said. The documentation was submitted to the International Magical Congress 3 weeks ago. The ICW has acknowledged receipt. You can verify that. He looked at Fontaine, who produced a folded document from his briefcase and passed it to the clerk. That's the acknowledgement letter. Umbridge's smile didn't waver. Professor Lebrun is a French academic with no standing in British wizarding law. He's also published 4 papers in the International Journal of Magical Bonds, which is peer-reviewed by academics from 14 wizarding nations, Hermione said, from the witness section. Miss Granger, you have not been invited to speak. She's a party to the proceedings, Fontaine said. Her input is legally relevant. The Triad Resonance, Amelia Bones said, cutting across Umbridge's response, is documented in British wizarding records as a Category 7 magical phenomenon. I am looking at a copy of the 1643 Wisengamot resolution that classified it as such, which defines it as, she read from the parchment in her hand, an extraordinary naturally occurring bond between 3 magical cores of exceptional resonant compatibility, classified outside the jurisdiction of magical interference and accorded the same protections as any naturally occurring magical faculty. She put the parchment down. In what sense is this bond subject to restriction? The silence this time was of a different quality, the silence of a room in which a plan has visibly come apart. Fudge said, well, the question of the Vila heritage is a question about Miss Delacour's ancestry, Bones said, which this Wisengamot has no authority to adjudicate, as she is a French national. Unless the minister would like to formally extend British jurisdiction to the magical bloodlines of France, which I expect would be interesting for our diplomatic relations. Several Wisengamot members were now showing the particular expression of people who had turned up expecting a straightforward proceeding and were recalibrating their predictions. Dumbledore spoke for the first time. His voice carried the specific quality of absolute comfort in chambers he had occupied for decades. I wonder if I might add a word. Fudge looked like he'd rather he didn't. Headmaster, the question before us, Dumbledore said, as if Fudge hadn't spoken, is whether the Ministry of Magic has standing to restrict a Category 7 magical phenomenon. I would suggest the answer is clearly no, and has been clearly no since 1643, and that proceeding further will not improve anyone's position. He folded his hands on the bench. I would further suggest that the question of Mr. Potter's living arrangements, now entered into the official record of this hearing, may warrant the Wisengamot's attention by a separate process, through the Department of Magical Children's Welfare. Fudge had gone from complicated pink to complicated white. Harry sat in the chair in the center of the chamber and felt the 3 threads, Hermione's hot and fierce, Fleur's very still in the way she went still when she was watching something with absolute attention, and looked at Dolores Umbridge, whose smile had finally changed. Not gone. Changed. It had moved from the confident smile of someone executing a plan to the careful smile of someone deciding what to salvage. Madam Undersecretary, Harry said. She looked at him. The bond is permanent. You understand that now, I think. Every expert in the room has confirmed it and the legal basis for challenging it has been removed. He kept his voice even. I'm not telling you this to be unkind. I'm telling you because attempting this again will have the same result, and trying a 3rd time would suggest the ministry isn't learning from experience, which would be worse for the ministry than for us. The chamber was completely silent. Amelia Bones made a sound that was deliberately not a laugh. She was looking at a 12-year-old boy sitting in a chair designed to intimidate, who had delivered that last sentence with the tone of someone wrapping up a business meeting. I move to dismiss, Fontaine said. Seconded, said Bones. The vote was called. It was not, in the end, close. Outside the ministry, on the marble steps under a grey November sky, Apollon Delacour put her hand on Harry's shoulder briefly, not the patronizing touch of an adult managing a child, but the genuine contact of one person acknowledging another. You were very good in there, she said. Fontaine did the work. Fontaine did the law. You did something else. She paused. You spoke about the cupboard. It needed saying. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she'd been wearing since the atrium, the one that had replaced the wariness that Harry still didn't have a complete name for. "My daughter has been right about you," she said, and went to speak with Fontaine. Ron appeared at Harry's elbow and handed him a pasty that he'd apparently produced from his coat pocket. "From Mum's package this morning," he said. "She'd want you to have something after all that." Harry took it. He ate it standing on the ministry steps in the cold and thought it was the best thing he'd tasted in recent memory. Fleur came and stood beside him. Not close enough for the thread to do what it had done in the atrium, she was giving him space he hadn't asked for but that she'd assessed he might want, which was the specific kind of perceptiveness that didn't announce itself. They stood shoulder to shoulder looking out at the street beyond the ministry entrance. "The cupboard," she said quietly. "Not a question. Not anymore. McGonagall had words with someone over the summer. He'd gotten a bedroom last July, a real one, with a door that locked from the inside. He suspected the process had involved letters from both Hogwarts and the ministry's welfare department, though nobody had told him this directly. It's fine. It is not fine that it happened. No, he agreed. But it's over." She was quiet for a moment. "In France, after the hearing, when my mother speaks about you now, she does not use the same tone she used before. You should know that. I heard what she said. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "I know. That's where you got it." Fleur looked at him sideways. Something in her expression that was very young and very real under the composed surface, the way things were sometimes visible through ice. "I have to go back," she said. "Tomorrow. Beaux batons. I know. The distance will be worse now. Having been here." "Yes." He thought about what she'd written from Beaux batons. "The thread to you both has been louder since November." Being this close had made it more specific, more dimensional, and going back across the channel would not be going back to what it was before. The bond had registered the proximity and would miss it. "It'll be worse for about a week and then it'll stabilize," he said. "That's what happened when Hermione and I," he stopped. "When you went back to Surrey after Diagon Alley. You remembered that." "I remember everything you write to me." She said it simply. "The tournament is in 2 years. I will be at Hogwarts for most of a year. Then the distance will be gone and it will not be re-established." She paused. "I have decided this." Harry smiled. "You've decided the Triad tournament placement?" "I have decided my own intentions regarding it. The rest will follow." She said this with the complete certainty of someone who had spent 17 years being right about the things she decided. "Write more this week. The thread will be adjusting. It helps." "I will." "Same to you." Hermione had come out through the ministry doors and was standing at Harry's other side, looking at the street with the expression she wore after significant events, still processing, taking inventory, 2 stages away from being ready to debrief but needing to arrive there in her own time. The 3 of them stood on the ministry steps together in the November cold. Harry felt the threads, both of them, close and bright, Hermione's warm and slightly raw with feeling, Fleur's steady and present and very deliberately present, as if she was choosing it consciously, and thought about what Dumbledore had said in October, about what lay ahead. About darkness that hadn't left the world. He thought about sitting in the center of that chamber at 12 years old and saying the cupboard under the stairs and watching the room change. He thought about Fontaine and Bones and the 1643 classification and Fleur's 2 days in London and the pasty from Molly Weasley's care package. He thought that the thing the ministry had attempted to restrict was, from every available angle, the least restrictable thing that had ever been in that chamber, and that the people who'd tried would eventually understand this in the same way Professor Marchbanks had understood it, not gently, but completely. "Right," Hermione said, from his left. "I'm hungry." "Ron has food," Harry said. "Obviously Ron has food." She straightened her robes. "Fleur. We have until tomorrow." I want to go somewhere and actually talk, properly, in person, for the first time. Not about the bond. About everything else. Fleur looked at her. The young, real expression came back briefly. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. They went down the steps together and into the grey November city, Fleur pulling her coat around her shoulders against the cold, Hermione already calculating which café had the best chairs, Ron producing a second pasty from his coat apparently from nowhere. 3 threads. All 3 bright. The ministry behind them, and everything else ahead. Chapter 5, The Cost. Third year arrived with Dementors on the train. Harry felt them before the compartment went cold, a darkening in the threads, not Hermione's or Fleur's but something external pressing against the bond the way weather pressed against glass. Then the temperature dropped and the lights went out and the corridor outside their compartment filled with a quality of dark that had nothing to do with the absence of light. He stood up. The thing that came through the compartment door was tall and hooded and wrong in a way that bypassed ordinary fear and went straight for something older, and Harry felt it pulling at him, not physically, but reaching into the specific weight of the worst things, Surrey and the cupboard and Vernon's voice, trying to find the bottom of him. He felt the threads go sharp with Hermione's distress and Ron's, felt Ron hit the floor from the seat, heard Hermione make a sound that wasn't quite a word. Something in Harry's chest went very still. Then it went warm, the threads, pulling inward, Fleur's all the way from France, present and immediate, and he raised his hand toward the Dementor and said, clearly, get out. Nothing happened for a moment. The cold intensified. The dark pulling sensation deepened. He thought about the letters. 3 years of letters, then 2 years more, 5 years of knowing people he hadn't met yet and meeting them and finding them real. He thought about Hermione's face outside Gringotts. Fleur on the ministry steps in November cold. The pasty. Ron with his food and his simple, uncomplicated loyalty. He thought about Fleur writing better when I write to you and meaning it, and Hermione saying I trust you with the surprise of someone who'd said something truer than they intended. The warmth in his chest expanded outward. Not a spell. Not anything he'd been taught. Something that came from the same place the pulse had come from 5 years ago in the Dursley kitchen, purely himself, no technique, no form. And it hit the Dementor and the Dementor retreated into the corridor and the cold receded and the compartment lights flickered back on. Ron was on the floor with his hands over his ears. Hermione was upright, white-faced, her wand out and shaking slightly. The new defense against the dark arts professor, who had apparently been asleep in the corner this whole time under a moth-eaten traveling cloak and was now very much awake, was looking at Harry with an expression that Harry couldn't immediately categorize. Remarkable, Professor Lupin said quietly. Harry sat back down and looked at his hands, which were perfectly steady. He felt faintly warm, the same way he'd felt after the pulse in 1988, the absence of pressure, clean and clear. Chocolate, Lupin said, producing a bar and breaking it and handing pieces around. Everyone. It's important. Harry ate his piece. What was that? A Dementor. A guard from Azkaban. They're stationed along the train because of, there's a situation. I'll explain later. Lupin looked at him with the unclassifiable expression again. What you did just now isn't a standard magical response to Dementor exposure, Mr. Potter. I know. Most people cast a Patronus. You didn't cast anything. I know. He looked at Lupin steadily. You knew my parents. It wasn't an accusation. It was the same thing he'd done in the ministry, identifying what was true and saying it plainly. Lupin went very still, and then something in his face shifted that Harry recognized from Apollon Delacour's face on the ministry steps, the expression of someone whose bracing had just become unnecessary. Yes, Lupin said. I did. Then I'll talk to you properly later, Harry said. Hermione had been watching this exchange with the focused attention she brought to anything significant. She caught Harry's eye across the compartment and he read in her expression, I'll research him. I'll find out what you need to know before you need to know it. He gave a slight nod that meant thank you, and she turned to check on Ron, who was recovering from the floor with the determination of someone who was embarrassed and was managing it through action. The letter from Marcus Vane was waiting on Harry's bed when he got to the dormitory that night. It was on plain parchment, no house crest, the handwriting neat and precise in the way that suggested someone who had trained themselves out of natural messiness. Harry read it standing up. "Potter, you don't know me. I'm a fifth-year Ravenclaw prefect. My name is Marcus Vane. I've been watching the development of the Triad bond you hold with Granger and Delacour since last year, initially as a personal research project and increasingly because what I've found concerns me seriously enough that I think you need to hear it. I'm not an enemy. I'm not working for the Ministry or for anyone else. I need you to understand that before you respond, because what I'm going to tell you sounds like something an enemy would say. I want to meet. Thursday, 8 o'clock, the alcove off the third-floor corridor near the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy. Tell no one until after we've spoken. M. Vane. Harry read it twice. He thought about Fleur's instruction from 3 years ago, be careful who you tell about the bond. He thought about Hermione's methodology, which was always to gather information before drawing conclusions. He thought about the specific tone of the letter, which was not hostile and not friendly but genuinely urgent in the way that things were urgent when the urgency was real rather than performed. He went downstairs and found Hermione. He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it. Her expression moved through several stages: suspicion, assessment, the slight narrowing that meant she was evaluating something rigorously. Thursday, she said. I'm going. I'm coming. He said tell no one. He said tell no one until after we've spoken. I'm coming with you before we've spoken. That's technically compliant. She folded the letter. Marcus Vane. Ravenclaw 5th year. I know who he is, he's been in the library researching magical bonds for months. I've seen his checkout records. A pause. He checks out serious books. Not sensational ones. Historical records, academic papers. He's doing real research. That's what I thought. He said it sounds like something an enemy would say. She looked at the letter again. What do you think the thing is that sounds like that? Something wrong with the bond, Harry said. Or something wrong with us. Hermione's jaw tightened briefly. I'll be there Thursday. I know. He wrote to Fleur that night, not the full contents of the letter, but the shape of it. Someone has found something about the bond that they think is concerning. I don't know what yet. I wanted you to know before I find out, so that when I tell you what it is, you have time to think about it rather than react to it. Her reply came the next morning, and it said, You prepared me for bad news by warning me it was coming. That is, a crossed-out word, that is a kind thing to do. Tell me everything after Thursday. Marcus Vane was taller than Harry expected, which was always the surprise with people he'd only known from their handwriting. He was lean and dark-haired and had the specific watchfulness of someone who spent a lot of time reading between lines, and when he looked at Harry, he looked at him rather than at the scar, which Harry registered and credited him for. He looked at Hermione with a slight shift in expression that was recalibration rather than displeasure. I said tell no one. She's a party to the bond, Harry said. If you have something to say about it, she needs to hear it. Non-negotiable. Vane looked at them both for a moment. Then he sat down on the window ledge in the alcove and put the folder he was carrying on his knee and said, Right. Fine. You need to understand what I'm going to say is not an attack. I want to be very clear about that before I start. Say it, Harry said. Vane opened the folder. My sister's name was Clara Vane. She was 26 when she died. She died 8 years ago, which makes her 26 in 1985, which means she was 17 in 1976. He looked up. She was bonded. Not a triad, a pair bond. It's less rare than a triad, not common but documented. The bond formed during her 6th year at Hogwarts. The other party was a 7th year, considerably more powerful than her, from a very old family with very specific interests. He paused. The bond is documented in the historical record as natural. As a genuine resonance bond. But the outcome for my sister was, everything she was got redirected. Her magic, her attention, her choices. She stopped writing. She stopped seeing friends. She stopped having preferences about anything except what was good for him. By the time she was 20 she had no autonomous magical expression left. She could only cast in his presence. Harry listened to this without speaking. Beside him Hermione was very still. The bond didn't do that to her, Vane said, and his voice had the quality of someone who had said this sentence many times to himself before saying it aloud to anyone else. I know it didn't. The bond was real. But it was used, he used the bond as a mechanism. As a framework for control. He claimed it was natural deepening. He had the records to prove the bond was genuine. But the way he operated within it, he closed the folder. I've been looking at the Triad Resonance documentation since the Ministry hearing last year. What Fontaine submitted to the ICW. Lebrun's paper. The 1643 classification. All of it. He looked at Harry. It's real. I believe it's real. I'm not here to tell you the bond is fabricated. Then what are you here to tell me? Harry said. I'm here to tell you that a genuine bond can still be leveraged. That there are people, not just Umbridge, she's obvious and she's lost, but people with more intelligence and more patience who will look at what you have and decide to use it rather than destroy it. He paused. Specifically, I'm telling you to look very carefully at Albus Dumbledore. The alcove went quiet. Harry could feel Hermione beside him, processing, not reacting yet, processing. What about him? Harry said. The bond makes you stronger. All three of you, but particularly you, because you're the primary locus. A fully formed triad resonance in an adult who has been trained and tested, the historical records suggest a level of magical capacity that has no parallel in modern wizarding Britain. Vane looked at him steadily. Dumbledore has a plan for you. Everyone knows there's a plan, he doesn't hide it well enough, he's too certain about how things will go. And his plan requires you to walk a specific path at a specific pace and arrive at a specific place. He paused. What happens to that plan if you get too strong too fast? If the bond accelerates what you are? If you're not the managed, directed, carefully cultivated weapon he needs you to be? He tries to manage the bond, Hermione said. Flat and precise. He tries to manage Harry. The bond is just the most recent tool he doesn't have control over. Harry was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the Patronus he hadn't cast on the train. He thought about Dumbledore's office in first year, I believe there is a darkness that has not fully left the world, and the specific calculation behind the warmth. He thought about the headmaster's nod at the hearing, which he deliberately not interpreted. You said your sister died at 26, he said. Vane's expression shifted. He left. When she was 24. When he had what he needed from the bond, the social connections, the family influence she'd redirected to him. He found a way to extract what he needed and step back, and without his presence the bond, it had been so long since she'd had autonomous magical expression that she couldn't rebuild it. Her magic failed completely within 2 years. He looked at his folder. A healer at St. Mungo's told my family that what happened to her had never been documented before. That it shouldn't have been possible for a genuine resonance bond to result in that kind of collapse. It shouldn't have been, Hermione said. A genuine resonance bond reinforces autonomous expression. It doesn't subsume it. What you're describing is a corruption of the bond's function, someone who understood the mechanics well enough to work against them from the inside. She had the focused, slightly terrible quality she had when she was doing something painful with her intelligence. I'm very sorry about your sister. Vane looked at her. I know you are, he said, and it was clear he meant it, that he'd expected hostility or dismissal and had gotten something else. I know the bond isn't the problem. I needed to tell someone who could actually use the information. And Harry needed to hear about Dumbledore. I've been thinking about Dumbledore, Harry said. I know. You handled him well in first year from what I heard. He's not my enemy. No. Vane was certain about this. But he has a purpose for you, and his purpose and your freedom aren't the same thing, and the bond is accelerating your freedom faster than he planned for. That's going to create friction. He stood, closing the folder. The reason I'm telling you about Clara is because I want you to understand what it looks like when someone operates against a bond from inside it. So you can recognize it. Not because I think that's what Dumbledore is doing, I don't. I think he's something more like well-intentioned infrastructure. But you should know the shape of the danger so you can see anything that rhymes with it. Harry looked at him for a moment. Why do you care? Because my sister deserved better. Simple and direct. Because she was real and what happened to her was wrong, and if there's a Triad Resonance forming in my school and it's going to be challenged from a dozen different angles, then the people in it deserve to have someone in their corner who isn't doing it for their own reasons. What are your reasons? I want to see it work, Vane said. Properly. The way the bond is supposed to work. I never got to see that. He picked up his folder and looked at Harry with the steady attention he'd had from the beginning. I'm a prefect. I have access to restricted sections of the library the others don't. I'm good at research and I'm good at keeping my mouth shut. If you want someone in your corner who's not already in the middle of it, I'm available. Harry looked at Hermione. She gave a slight nod, the nod that meant I've evaluated this and I believe him. We'll be in touch, Harry said. He told Fleur everything in a letter that ran to 6 pages, which was the longest letter he'd ever written her, and her reply came back in 3 days and ran to 8, which told him she'd been thinking continuously in the interval. What Vane described about his sister, I have been thinking about it since I read your letter, and I want to be honest with you about something that I have been mostly honest with myself about but have not said directly. The thing I was most afraid of, when my mother first explained what the bond might be, was exactly that. Not the bond itself. The loss of myself inside it. I have spent my life being defined by the Vila blood, by what people want from me, by what I represent to them. The thought of a bond that might do the same thing but from inside was a gap. It was the thing that made me angry at my mother for being afraid, because I recognized the fear. I am not afraid of that anymore. I want to explain why, and I want to be clear that it is not because I have decided to trust blindly. When I met you and Hermione at the ministry, I expected to feel smaller, maybe. In the presence of the primary locus, in the reality of what the bond is rather than the letters of it. Instead, I felt more like myself than I have felt in years. The thread, close range, it does not pull me toward either of you. It pulls me toward myself. It is as if the frequency of the bond resonates with the truest part of what I am and amplifies that. Not your preferences. Mine. I think that is what Professor Lebrun meant. About accepting ourselves. The bond finds what is already true and makes it louder. Which means if what is true in us is good, the bond makes that louder. And which also means the only way someone could corrupt it is by first corrupting what is true in us. I trust you. I trust Hermione. I trust what is true in myself. That is my answer to Vane's warning. Now, Dumbledore. I've been thinking about him separately. Here is what I think. He is a man who has fought darkness for so long that he has accepted damage as the price of winning. He paid that price himself, you can tell from the way people talk about him, the things left unsaid, and he is prepared to ask you to pay it too. Not from cruelty. From a kind of terrible pragmatism. He believes the cost is worth it. He may be right about the cost. He is wrong about who gets to decide whether you pay it. Come to Hogsmeade when I arrive in the autumn. I want to see you properly, not in a ministry hearing room or in letters. I want to sit somewhere quiet with both of you and be three people who know each other. Harry read this letter by the fire on a Sunday evening, Hermione beside him working through arithmancy, the common room otherwise empty because everyone else was at the Quidditch match. He read the section about trusting herself and what is true, and he felt the thread warm in a way that was specific and weightful. He felt Fleur being honest at 8 pages and meaning every word. He thought about Vane's warning and Fleur's answer to it and found that they were, in fact, the same thing approached from different angles. He thought about the cupboard, which he could think about directly now without the old flinching, and thought that what had kept him intact through the years in it was exactly what Fleur had articulated, not defiance of what was happening but a core of something true about himself that the circumstances couldn't reach. He'd never needed anyone to tell him he was real. He'd always known. The bond had simply found 2 other people who were real in complementary ways. She's right about Dumbledore, Hermione said, without looking up. You read over my shoulder. You held it at an angle that made it easy. She turned a page of her arithmancy text. He's not wrong that something's coming. He's not even wrong about the cost. He's wrong about one thing. Which thing? He thinks you'll walk the path he's laid because you don't know there are other paths. She looked up. He hasn't accounted for the fact that you've spent 5 years with people who love you enough to give you better options. Harry looked at her. The words sat in the air between them, not awkward, not performed. Simply true, in the way that Hermione said true things, with the slightly surprised quality of someone who had meant to say something slightly more defended and had overshot into honesty. Love, he said. Don't make it strange, she said, and returned to her arithmancy with the slightly heightened color of someone who had meant what they said and was not going to elaborate under any circumstances. Harry smiled at the fire. He felt both threads warm, Hermione's vivid and close, Fleur's across the channel and steady, and something between the two of them that didn't pass through him but connected them directly, which was a development in the bond's architecture that he'd noticed over the last few months and hadn't found the right words to describe. The bond wasn't triangulated through him. It was a triangle. All 3 edges equally real. Lupin taught him the Patronus charm on Thursday evening starting in October, in an empty classroom with a boggart in a wardrobe that neither of them discussed directly. What Harry produced on the first attempt wasn't a full Patronus, it was a silvery white light that filled the room and made Lupin go very still and then very carefully make no comment about its scale. On the 3rd session it became a stag. Fully corporeal, moving through the classroom with the specific gravity of something that had decided it was real and was now simply being itself. It turned its head and looked at Harry with amber eyes. Harry looked back at it. Your father, Lupin said, from across the room. I know. You know about him? Some. He looked at the stag. More every year. You've been telling me things in sessions without calling them things. I appreciate that. He looked at Lupin directly. You knew he wasn't a good husband to my mother, at first. Before he changed. Lupin was quiet for a moment. He was 17 and arrogant and very gifted and not yet someone who understood what he had. He became that person. He became someone your mother chose because she wanted to choose him, not because, he stopped. Not because of a bond, Harry said. Lupin looked at him. You know about the Triad. Of course I know. The stag was fading slowly, dissolving back into warm silver light. What do you think about it? I think, Lupin said carefully, that it is the least surprising thing I've heard about you. Your magic has always been, not larger than other people's. More specific. More intentional, even when it's uncontrolled. As if everything you do magically knows exactly what it's supposed to be doing. He paused. A bond that finds that in 2 other people and locks them together seems, in retrospect, inevitable. People keep saying things are inevitable about me. Does it bother you? Harry considered this honestly. It would bother me if inevitable meant I didn't get to choose. It doesn't mean that. Inevitable just means the circumstances were right for something true to happen. He banished the boggart back into the wardrobe with a flick that was, Lupin's expression suggested, significantly more forceful than warranted. Dumbledore has a plan. Yes. You're part of it. Adjacent to it. Lupin chose his words with the care of a man navigating something he had mixed feelings about. He placed me here. Specifically this year. I think he wanted me to know you before things develop. He thought it would help. A pause. I'm not sure he was wrong about that. I do want to know you. That part is real. I know it is, Harry said. That's why I'm telling you. When the time comes, whatever Dumbledore has planned, I need people in my corner who are there because they choose to be. Not because they've been placed. Lupin looked at him for a long moment with the expression that had first appeared on the Hogwarts Express, unclassifiable then, classifiable now. It was grief and something that had survived grief and come out the other side into something functional and warm. I choose to be, Lupin said. Then we're fine, Harry said, and picked up his bag. Fleur arrived at Hogwarts on the 1st of November. Not officially. Officially she was arriving the following September for the tournament. But she had written in October that she had 3 days of mid-term break at Beauxbatons and that Professor Dumbledore had agreed, with what Fleur described as a smile that suggested he had anticipated this request and had chosen to allow it for reasons of his own, which I noted but did not let stop me, to permit a supervised visit. Harry felt her cross the Channel in the morning and felt her arrive in Scotland by afternoon and felt her come through the Hogwarts gates at 4:30 with the specific thread brightening of proximity returning, and he was in the entrance hall when she came through the doors. This time they both knew what was coming and it still hit. She stopped 2 feet in front of him and neither of them said anything for a moment. The thread was incandescent, the way it had been in the Ministry atrium, but different now, richer, more complex, because they'd had another year of letters and the bond had had another year of forming and what had been silk threads now felt more like something structural. Hello again, he said. Hello again, she said, and smiled, not the composed version, not the one she used when she was deciding how much to show, but the full one that he'd seen on the Ministry steps and which he thought she probably showed to very few people and was always specific and genuine. Hermione arrived behind him, slightly breathless. Fleur looked past Harry's shoulder and the smile changed, warmer, different, the one that was specifically for Hermione and had been developing in their direct correspondence, which had been ongoing since the Ministry and which Harry had deliberately not read because it wasn't his and they needed things that were only theirs. I have 3 days, Fleur said. 3 days is enough, Hermione said. Come on. I've found a room. She had found a room, a small parlor on the 2nd floor that was apparently used for nothing in particular and had 3 chairs that Hermione had already arranged around a fire that she'd lit, and tea, and Hermione's version of snacks which was somewhat more austere than Ron's version but present. She'd put books on the table, because Hermione always put books on available surfaces, and a copy of Lebrun's paper which she'd gotten Vane to source from the Ravenclaw Library's academic section. The 3 of them sat around the fire and the thread between all 3 of them was the loudest it had ever been, all 3 points present simultaneously for the first time since the Ministry, and Harry felt the architecture of it settle into something that wasn't new but was newly real, like a structure that had been built in stages finally having the last piece put in place. The Dumbledore question, Fleur said, after an hour of other things, catching up, the texture of daily life, Beauxbatons gossip that was genuinely funny, the Quidditch season, Ron's ongoing project of teaching the school chess champion a more aggressive opening gambit. Vane thinks he's managing Harry, Hermione said. Using the path of least resistance, giving Harry just enough information to keep him on track without enough to make autonomous choices. And what do you think? Fleur asked. I think Vane is mostly right but missing something. Dumbledore isn't a villain and he isn't stupid. He's a strategist who has decided that Harry's survival requires a specific emotional and psychological state, enough purpose, enough connection, enough to fight for, but not so much safety and power that Harry stops being willing to sacrifice. She looked at Harry. He's terrified of the bond. Not because it's dangerous. Because it makes you safe enough that the sacrifice he's planning to ask for might not be possible. Harry had known this for a while. He'd filed it and let it sit and not acted on it because acting on it required confronting Dumbledore directly, which required having something concrete to confront. The thing that Voldemort left behind, he said. In me. You've both read Horcruxes. Silence. Fleur had gone very still. You think you're one, Hermione said. Flat. Not a question. I think there's a piece of something in the scar that wasn't put there by love. I've thought it for about a year. Dumbledore knows, he knows more than he's told me about what the night my parents died actually created. Hermione closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them they were bright and fierce. Then we find out ourselves. Before he decides to tell us on his schedule. I know someone who might help, Harry said. Lupin has access to Dumbledore's confidence. Not all of it. But enough that he knows the shape of what Dumbledore isn't saying. En vain, Fleur said. His research, the historical triads. If there's a documented case of a triad member surviving something that should have been fatal, there is, Hermione said. The 1743 triad. The primary locus was struck by a curse in the third documented case that should have been lethal. It wasn't. The other two parties had enhanced recovery, the bond's architecture absorbed some of the damage. Fleur looked at Harry. He looked at her. The specific awareness moved between them that did not need to be spoken aloud. If the bond could do that, then whatever Dumbledore was afraid the bond would prevent, the sacrifice he was measuring Harry for, was different inside a triad. It had different parameters. Different costs. He hasn't told you, Fleur said, because telling you changes the calculus. If you know the bond might protect you, then you fight differently. Yes. Then we find out. We fight with what we actually are. She leaned forward slightly, the firelight in her silver blonde hair, her eyes entirely focused. Whatever Dumbledore has planned, he planned it for a boy with nothing to lose. You are not that. You have been not that since August 1988, you simply didn't have all the pieces yet. I have them now, Harry said. Yes, Hermione said. You do. The fire crackled. Outside, Hogwarts was dark with November, stars visible between clouds through the tall windows, the castle settling into its old nighttime rhythms. 3 people around a fire with 3 years of letters and 5 years of knowing each other and a bond that had, that evening, found its full configuration for the first time. Harry thought about Vane's sister and what it looked like when something was corrupted from the inside. He thought about Fleur's letter, the only way someone could corrupt it is by first corrupting what is true in us. He thought about what was true in himself and found it, as always, immediately and clearly, Hermione on the steps of Gringotts. Fleur in the November cold. Ron producing pastry from infinite coat pockets. Lupin saying I choose to be. He thought about whatever darkness was coming and felt no fear of it. Wariness, yes. Respect for its reality, yes. But fear required the belief that you were alone in what you faced, and he was, with complete and permanent certainty, not alone. 3 days, he said. 3 days, Fleur confirmed. And then the tournament. And then we stop being in separate countries. She looked between them. Permanently. I've decided. You've decided, Hermione said, with the expression she had when she was trying not to smile and losing. Yes. My decisions tend to become real. She was perfectly serious. Ask your bond mate. She's right, Harry said. Her decisions become real. I've been watching it happen for 5 years. Hermione did smile then, fully. Fleur sat back in her chair with the composed satisfaction of someone whose point has been made. The fire was warm. The threads were warmer. Outside, November did what it did, cold and indifferent to the particular warmth inside one second-floor parlor in a Scottish castle where 3 people had finally, completely, found the full weight of what they were together, and were, without hesitation or reservation, choosing it. Chapter 6. The Deciding the Triwizard Tournament arrived at Hogwarts in September of Harry's 4th year like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward in every direction simultaneously. Fleur came with the Beauxbatons delegation on a Thursday evening, and Harry felt her crossing the grounds from the castle entrance, felt the thread sharpen from warm to vivid, and kept his face entirely neutral because he was sitting at the Gryffindor table with 400 other students and he had learned, over 6 years, to keep what was his private until he chose otherwise. Beside him, Hermione made a small sound that might have been a breath-catching. The Beauxbatons students came through the doors in a column, moving with the practiced elegance of a school that had decided presentation was a subject, and Fleur was 3 rows back from the front, silver blonde and 17 and entirely herself in a way that the room, predictably, registered immediately. Half the Gryffindor table went slightly stupid. Harry ate his dinner. She found him with her eyes the moment she cleared the door. Not the scar. Not the famous person scan that everyone else did, the automatic seek of a face they'd attached a story to. She found him, specifically, the way you found something you'd been looking for long enough that you recognized it before you consciously processed it. The eye contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She moved to the Beauxbatons section of the hall. "She's more," Hermione started. "I know. The thread is, I know." Ron, on Harry's other side, was looking at the Beauxbatons delegation with the expression of someone who had been told that meeting Fleur in person was an experience and was now updating his predictions upward. "She's, Ron," Harry said pleasantly, "don't." Ron closed his mouth, looked at Harry, and evidently decided that whatever he'd been about to say was better left unsaid. He applied himself to his dinner with the philosophical acceptance of someone who understood there were situations he was navigating by feel. Fleur found him after the feast, in the entrance hall, which was emptying as students moved toward their common rooms. She was with another Beauxbatons girl who took one look at the encounter developing and moved away with quiet tact. They stood in the entrance hall in the post-feast noise and Harry felt the thread do its close-range thing, incandescent, dimensional, pulling everything in both of them toward the clearest version of itself. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she confirmed. "Permanently, as I said. Until June." "Permanently," she repeated, with the specific finality she used for things she'd decided. "What happens in June is logistics. I am done being in a different country." She looked at him with the direct, layered expression that her letters had always had but that in person had the additional dimension of a real face behind it. "Hermione? Common room. She said to give you 5 minutes and then she's coming to find you herself. 3.5 years of letters and she's giving me 5 minutes. A flicker of something warm crossed her face. She has gotten more impatient. She's been looking forward to this. He paused. We both have. I know. She looked around the entrance hall, the vaulted stone, the torches. It is strange to be here physically. I have read Hermione's descriptions of this place so many times that it feels familiar and foreign simultaneously. She looked back at him. There is something I need to tell you. Before the tournament, before the complications begin, and they will begin, I know this school has a history of complications, I need to say something directly. All right. The bond, she paused, which was unusual for her. In my letters I have been honest about most things. But there is one thing I have been circling around rather than saying, and I am going to say it now because I have decided that precision is more important than comfort. He waited. I am here because I choose to be here. Not because of the bond. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The bond is real and it is mine and I do not resent it. But I am at Hogwarts, standing in this hall, having told my mother that I would find a way to be in England this year and having meant it, because I want to be. Because you and Hermione are the first people in my life who have seen me rather than what I look like or what I can offer, and the first people who have been honest with me without wanting something from the honesty. She looked at him steadily. The bond found something true. I am choosing what was found. Those are different things and I need you to know the difference. Harry looked at her for a moment. The thread between them was very warm and very quiet simultaneously, the specific quality it had when something real had been said and didn't need anything added to it. I know the difference, he said. I've always known. Yes, she said. I know you have. That is part of why I'm here. Hermione appeared at the top of the staircase approximately 4.5 minutes after Harry had relayed the 5-minute window, which was Hermione's version of restraint. She came down the stairs at the controlled pace of someone who was not running but had made that decision quite recently, and when she reached the bottom and looked at Fleur, the same thing happened that had happened in the Ministry atrium 2 years ago. The composition dropped, just briefly, replaced by something genuine and young and very glad. They stood in the entrance hall, the three of them, with the bond fully closed around all 3 points, and the specific quality of that was something Harry had been thinking about for 6 years. It was not the lightening of the pulse in 1988 or the sharp contraction of the attempted severing or the close-range incandescence of the Ministry. It was something more like equilibrium. Like a structure finding its load-bearing configuration and settling. Complete. Come on, Hermione said. I have a room. The goblet of fire spat Harry's name out on Halloween and the Great Hall went still in a way that Harry had learned, over 4 years, was the particular stillness of people who were genuinely surprised rather than performing it. He stood up. He felt both threads go sharp and alert. He looked at the slip of parchment in Dumbledore's hand and then at Dumbledore's face, which was doing something careful and controlled, and then at the slip of parchment again, and thought, someone put my name in. Someone who wanted me in this tournament and had reasons. He filed it and walked to the door to the anteroom. He was not afraid. He was paying very close attention. The other champions were already there, Cedric Diggory, pleasant and careful, who nodded at Harry with the measured politeness of someone who wasn't sure what he thought yet. Victor Crumb, broad-shouldered and watchful, who looked at Harry with the assessing eyes of someone who evaluated things before he said anything about them. And Fleur, who was already standing with her arms crossed and her expression set in the composed version, which Harry knew meant she was managing something. She looked at him when he came in. He gave a slight nod, I'm all right. Her expression shifted minutely, I know. Someone did this deliberately. We'll deal with it. 6 years of letters had created a language that didn't require words. Dumbledore came in with the other heads of school. Dumbledore's expression, Harry noted, was not the expression of someone who was surprised. It was the expression of someone who had anticipated something and was watching it arrive. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice had the specific warmth he always used with Harry, the warmth that was real and calculated simultaneously. Did you put your name in the goblet? No, Harry said. Did you ask an older student to? No. He kept his voice even. I don't want to be in the tournament. I'm 14 years old. He looked at Dumbledore with the same steadiness he'd used since first year, the look that did not require conflict but did not absorb redirection. Someone put my name in. I'd like to know who and why. That seems more relevant than whether I did it myself. Moody, the new defense professor, who had arrived in September with the specific energy of someone carrying a great deal of history, made a sound from the corner that might have been approval. Bartemius Crouch Sr. said something about magical contracts. Harry listened, filed the information, and thought about what it meant that the goblet's magic could be circumvented and that whoever had done it carefully enough to pass as legitimate. He thought about what Hermione had said about Voldemort's darkness not having left the world. He thought about what was in the scar. I'll compete, he said, when Crouch finished. Since apparently I don't have a choice. But I want it on the record that I did not enter voluntarily and that the question of who did should be the Ministry's priority. Crouch looked at him with the expression of someone who had expected a 14-year-old and was recalibrating. Noted, he said. The champions' preparation period was the 1 hour per week when Harry and Fleur were officially in the same space, which Madame Maxime apparently accepted and Dumbledore accepted and the tournament officials accepted because there was no rule against champions speaking to each other, and Harry was relatively certain Fleur had already identified the rule that would have prevented it and confirmed its non-existence before anyone thought to check. They used the hour strategically. Fleur had read the historical tournament records, all of them, 3 months of reading before she arrived, and had notes. Harry had Hermione, whose tournament research had begun the moment she'd heard about the event being reinstated and who had produced, by October, a comprehensive analysis of every task type used in the past 7 centuries. Ron had drawn detailed maps of the Hogwarts grounds from memory, including areas the official maps didn't show, which turned out to be more useful than any of them had expected. Krum started sitting in on the preparation session sometime in November, not by invitation but by the specific method of simply being present and useful. He was intelligent and direct and had the quality of someone who had been famous for long enough that it no longer interested him, and he and Harry developed the comfortable dynamic of two people who respected each other's competence without needing to perform it. The first task, Krum said one Tuesday, in the flat, precise English he used when he was being efficient. Dragons. I have confirmed this. My headmaster believes I don't know, but his office door was not sufficiently closed. I know, Harry said. How? Hagrid showed me. He seemed to think I needed the information. Harry paused. He was right. Have you told Fleur? She knew before I did, Krum said, with something that might have been admiration. She would not tell me how. She asked the right person, Harry said. She usually does. The first task was, in the event, straightforward in the specific way that things were straightforward when you were prepared and had thought carefully about the problem. Harry went after his golden egg not by confronting the dragon directly but by drawing it away from the nest with a summoned object, not his broom, which every other champion had used in some form, but a large piece of the stadium scaffolding that he'd worked out the structural tolerance of the previous week, repurposed as a distraction with enough noise and movement to hold the dragon's attention for 90 seconds while he retrieved the egg cleanly. The judges gave him 47 points. The audience gave him considerably more noise than that. In the champion's waiting area afterward, Fleur looked at the scaffolding maneuver he'd demonstrated in the margin of her notes with the expression she had for things that were more elegant than expected. The scaffolding, she said. I needed something big enough to interest a dragon and I already knew the weight distribution. You calculated the weight distribution of the stadium scaffolding. Hermione calculated it. I asked the right person. The corner of her mouth moved. We are becoming very efficient. Dumbledore asked Harry for a private meeting in November, 2 weeks after the first task. The office was the same, the instruments, the portraits, Fawkes on his perch. Fawkes made the low melodic sound when Harry came in that he always made, the opening note of something long. Harry sat down. He didn't wait. You need to tell me about the Horcruxes, he said. Dumbledore was very still for a moment. That is a significant word to introduce into a conversation. Yes. I've been thinking about it since 3rd year. Vane's research was the starting point, but the theory's mine and Hermione's. We've confirmed it well enough that I'd rather hear what you actually know than keep working from inference. He held Dumbledore's gaze. You've known since the night it happened. What Voldemort left in me isn't a scar. It's a fragment. The silence in the office lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Dumbledore's expression moved through several stages, the first surprise Harry had ever genuinely seen on him, which told him the directness of the approach had achieved something, and then into something that was, ultimately, relief. As if a weight he'd been carrying had been set down by someone else's hands. Yes, Dumbledore said. Tell me everything. And Dumbledore told him. It took an hour. Harry listened without interrupting, asking 3 questions at precise moments when the information required clarification, and by the end he had the full architecture of it, the Horcruxes, the plan, the night in Godric's Hollow, what the prophecy said and what it meant, and the thing Dumbledore had believed since Harry was 11 years old, that at some point, for Voldemort to be destroyable, the fragment in Harry would need to be destroyed too. That Harry would need to die. Or something close enough to dying to achieve the same result. When Dumbledore finished, the fire had burned lower. Fawkes was watching Harry with the orange fire gaze he always used. "You've been managing the pace of what I know," Harry said. "Keeping me capable without making me powerful enough that the sacrifice starts to feel avoidable." Dumbledore looked at him with something that was genuine pain. "Yes. You were afraid the bond would make it avoidable. I was afraid the bond would make you believe it was avoidable. Whether it truly is," he stopped. "Whether it truly is," Harry said, "is something you didn't want me to investigate. Because if the answer was yes, the plan required rewriting. The plan requires that Tom Riddle be destroyed. Everything else is negotiable." Dumbledore's voice was quiet. "I have told myself that for 14 years and I have believed most of it." Harry looked at him. He thought about what Fleur had said in the entrance hall on the first night, "I am choosing what was found." He thought about what Hermione had said by the fire in 3rd year, "You have people who love you enough to give you better options." He thought about Lupin saying "I choose to be in Vane's research" and the 1743 Triad and the fragment in the scar and the bond's full architecture complete around 3 points and carrying, for the first time in history, something Dumbledore hadn't planned for. "The bond can help me survive it," Harry said. "We've been researching it for a year. The 1743 case, the primary locus absorbed a lethal curse and survived. The other 2 parties took part of the impact through the bond's architecture. It wasn't comfortable. But it was survivable." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "You've been preparing for this conversation." "I've been preparing for what the conversation would require." He held the headmaster's gaze. "I'm not angry with you. I want to be clear about that. You did what you thought was necessary. Your thinking was wrong on some things and right on others, and I'm not going to spend energy on the wrong parts." He paused. "What I need from you now is full information. Everything you know, when you know it. No schedule. No managed pace. If I'm going to face what's coming, I face it with everything I actually am." The pause was long. Then Dumbledore said, quietly, "Yes. All right. Good." Harry stood. "I'll send Hermione the research summary tomorrow. She'll want to go over it with you." A sound from Fawkes, the same low melodic note, but longer this time. Dumbledore looked at his phoenix and back at Harry with the expression of a man standing in a room that had been arranged differently from how he'd left it, and finding, to his own surprise, that the new arrangement was better. "Your father," he said, "would have handled that the same way. Minus the research summary." "Minus the research summary," Harry agreed, and said good night. The second task was underwater. Harry had known about it since opening the egg in October. Hermione had solved it in 2 days, Ron in 4, Fleur in 2 hours with the specific impatience of someone who found encoded messages personally offensive. What the task required him to find under the Black Lake, Ron, who was there as his most valued person, unconscious on the lake bed with enchanted stone weighted to him. This had been arranged by the tournament without anyone asking Harry what the right answer was, which was a small but clarifying example of how the tournament had been managed throughout. He went into the water at 9 and came back up at 53 minutes with Ron. He also came up with Fleur's younger sister Gabrielle, who Fleur had not been able to reach because she'd been attacked by Grindylows on the way down and whose continued presence on the lake bed was not something Harry had been prepared to accept regardless of tournament rules. The judges deducted 5 points for exceeding the time limit. Harry accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had not made the decision with the points in mind. Fleur was at the water's edge when he surfaced, soaked and dragging both Ron and Gabrielle. She was already there because she'd known. The thread had given her the direction and the urgency, and she'd pushed through the crowd to the bank before he'd broken the surface. She took Gabrielle immediately, wrapped her in a conjured blanket, held her and checked her, and looked at Harry over her sister's head with an expression that had set aside everything, composed, and was simply, entirely itself. "Thank you," she said. "She's fine," Harry said. "Thank you," Fleur said again, with the specific quality she used for things that mattered too much to be said only once. He hauled himself out of the water. Hermione was 2 steps behind Fleur and threw a warming charm at him that was approximately twice as powerful as necessary, which he took as an expression of feeling rather than miscalculation. "You went past the hour," she said. "I know. The points, I know, Hermione." She looked at him. She had the expression she wore when she was making a decision about whether to lecture or let something go. She let it go. "Are you all right?" "Yes." He looked at the water, which was dark and moving, and then back at her. The thread helped. Knowing the direction. She nodded. "I felt you the whole time. Both of us did." She glanced at Fleur, who was still holding Gabrielle. "The underwater section, your core temperature dropped significantly. I could feel it." "Through the bond?" "Through the bond." She said it matter-of-factly. "We're going to need to talk about what the bond is doing architecturally. The range on the physical feedback is..." She stopped. "Later." "Not now." "Not now," he agreed. "Tea first." "Yes," she said. "Tea first." Marcus Vane found Harry in the library in March. He'd been consistent since 3rd year, present, useful, asking nothing beyond what the situation required. He brought research when he had it and asked questions when he didn't, and Harry had come to regard him with the specific trust that developed for people who were exactly what they said they were over an extended period. He put a folder on the table. ICW correspondence. Professor Lebrun's formal paper got a response. Harry opened it. 3 pages, on ICW letterhead, dense with formal language that resolved, under Hermione's annotation in the margins, she'd clearly already seen this, into the following: the International Confederation of Wizards had reviewed Professor Lebrun's formal documentation of the Triad Resonance. They had consulted their historical records, which contained 2 prior documented instances. They were formally convening a committee to review the legal status and protections applicable to a recognized Triad bond. Timeline? Harry said. 6 months minimum. Possibly a year. Vane sat down. The committee will have representatives from France, Britain, and 4 other nations. Fontaine is already on it. He paused. Lebrun is presenting the full research, all 4 documented instances, including yours. He's arguing for full ICW recognition and a charter protection that would make any ministry-level interference internationally illegal. Umbridge will oppose it, Hermione said. Umbridge has already written to the British ICW representative. I have a copy of the letter. Vane produced it from a separate folder. She's arguing that the Triad constitutes an unregistered foreign magical influence on a British national, which she's attempting to frame as a security concern. Harry read the letter. It was well written in the specific way that Umbridge's work was always well written, every sentence technically accurate, every implication carefully wrong. He put it down. She's not going to win this one, he said. She almost got the Wisengamot hearing to run on a non-existent law. The ICW has actual lawyers. Fontaine is 80% confident of the outcome, Vane said. He said if Lebrun's paper is accepted as evidence, which it will be, the precedent from 1643 is binding and Britain doesn't have standing to override it. 20%, Hermione said. 20% covers the British representative mounting a serious opposition. Which requires a majority of the committee, which requires persuading 4 other nations' representatives that a naturally occurring magical bond is a security threat. Vane looked at Harry. Your testimony would help. Yours and Fleur's. In person, at the committee hearing. Harry thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. When? August. After the tournament. The third task was in June. August was after. Whatever was coming between now and August, the fragment in the scar, the third task, the darkness Dumbledore had been preparing for, was going to happen first, and then there would be August and the ICW committee, and Harry found, with the specific clarity that came from having thought through a problem completely, that the sequence felt right. Face what was coming. Then formalize what remained. Tell Fontaine yes, he said. June came with the third task and the maze and what was inside it, and Harry faced what was inside it. He came back from the graveyard. He came back holding Cedric's body, and he came back with the dark mark burning in the sky above Hogwarts, and he came back with Voldemort returned and embodied, and with the full weight of what had happened in a graveyard in Little Hangleton pressing against everything in him. He came back through the tournament cup's portkey and hit the Hogwarts grass and felt both threads flare simultaneously, incandescent, immediate, from 2 different directions across the grounds, felt them arrive in his perception like something breaking surface. Dumbledore was there first. Then the crowd. Then chaos. Through the chaos, both threads moved toward him with the specific directional urgency of people who were not managing the crowd but going through it, and the 2 things that reached him in the noise and the shock and the particular ringing silence that sat inside the chaos were Hermione's hand taking his hand, and Fleur's voice saying his name. He held on. Both of them. He let them be the anchor point while everything else moved, and felt the bond take some of the weight, not all of it, not the grief of Cedric or the thing he'd witnessed or the specific cold knowledge that Voldemort was real and present and back in the world. The bond didn't take what was real. But it held him in himself while he processed it, the way a foundation held a building while the weather moved through. I'm all right, he said, to both of them. You don't have to be yet, Hermione said. I know. But I am. The fragment, Fleur said, quietly, close to his ear, so only he could hear. Is it, still there? But it tried to leave tonight. I felt it, when Voldemort took my blood. Something shifted in the architecture. He looked at the sky, the dark mark dissolving. Dumbledore knows. I'll talk to him tomorrow. Tomorrow came and Dumbledore told him what he thought the blood had done, which confirmed what Harry had felt. The architecture had changed. The bond had already registered it, already adjusted, something in its structure moving to account for the new configuration. He sat with this for 2 days before he said anything to either of them about it, and when he did, Hermione produced 3 pages of analysis before he'd finished talking, and Fleur looked at him with the specific steadiness of someone who had already decided on her response and was waiting for the right moment. You'll survive it, she said. I think so. I think the bond, not only the bond, she said. You will survive it because you have never been someone who does anything halfway, and dying is not something you'll do without deciding whether it's actually necessary. Harry looked at her. He thought about Dumbledore's plan and the changed architecture and the research that said the bond could absorb some of what was coming. He thought about the specific quality of Fleur's certainty, which was not wishful thinking. She didn't do wishful thinking, she did assessment, and which meant she'd looked at the problem and reached a conclusion. When it happens, he said, stay connected. Both of you. Don't try to break the connection to protect yourselves. The bond's architecture works through the connection, not around it. We know, Hermione said. We've read the same research. I know you've read it. I need to hear you say you'll do it. Yes, they said, the word landing at the same moment from 2 directions, simultaneous and certain. The ICW committee hearing was on a Wednesday in mid-August. The room was formal, Geneva, the ICW's permanent seat, a circular chamber with the flags of 43 member nations and the specific quality of a room where things had been decided for centuries. Harry had been to the Ministry of Magic's hearing room at 12 and had found it oppressive by design. This room was different, not intimidating, but serious in the way that rooms were serious when the people who'd used them had been serious about their work. Maître Fontaine sat at the table with Harry and Fleur and Hermione. Vane was in the gallery. Apollon Delacour was in the gallery. Lupin was in the gallery, present because he'd asked to be and because Harry had wanted him there. Professor Lebrun was at the table as lead academic witness, 73 years old and wearing the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular hearing since he'd read his first paper on resonance bonds in 1952. The British representative had prepared an opposition. It was thorough and well argued and made approximately the case Umbridge had outlined in her letter to the ICW, refined and formalized by someone with actual credentials. Harry listened to it with the same attention he'd given every piece of opposition over the past 6 years, and when it was done, he looked at Fontaine, who stood. The 1643 classification took 12 minutes to establish as binding precedent. Lebrun's paper took 20 minutes to enter into the formal record. The historical documentation of all 4 triad instances, including the 1743 bond's demonstrated capacity to absorb lethal damage, took another 25. Then Harry spoke. He had not prepared remarks. He had notes, which he'd reviewed once and then set aside because prepared remarks felt false for something this specific. He spoke plainly, the way he always spoke in rooms like this, factual and direct, without anger or performance, saying what was true. He said, he had been 8 years old, and living in a cupboard, and something in him had responded to being made to feel like nothing and had said, without words, that it was not nothing. He said, the pulse had found 2 other people who were real and who had been real to him since the first letter, before he knew what a resonance bond was or what any of it meant. He said, 5 people had tried to stop this bond or restrict it or leverage it for their own purposes, and none of them had succeeded, not because the bond was indestructible, it was, but that wasn't the point, but because what the bond had identified was already too real to be undone by anyone outside it. He said, the bond was not something that happened to him. It was something he had chosen, every day for 6 years, in every letter and every conversation and every moment of deciding to be honest rather than defended, to be present rather than managed. The bond had recognized what was true. He had decided what was true was worth keeping. The chamber was quiet when he finished. Fleur spoke next. She spoke in French and her French was precise and elegant and she said, in her own words, what she'd told him in the entrance hall on the first night, that she was here by choice, that the bond had found something real, that she claimed what was found. She said it with the composure that was not performance and the certainty that was not arrogance and the specific pride of someone who had earned the right to stand in a room and take up exactly the space she occupied. Hermione spoke last. She was thorough and she was brilliant and she went through the research with the focus she'd been applying to everything she'd ever cared about, and at the end she said something Harry hadn't expected. She said that the most significant thing about the bond, in her assessment, was not its power or its permanence or its documented precedent. It was that it had found 3 people who had been, separately, isolated and misread and made to feel like complications in other people's plans, and had put them in each other's way. She said, the bond did not make them who they were. But it gave them the right context to be it. She said that was worth protecting. The vote was called at 3 in the afternoon. 31 to 12 in favor of full ICW recognition and charter protection. Fontaine allowed himself a small, private smile. Lebrun closed his briefcase with the satisfaction of a man whose life's work had just been formally acknowledged. In the gallery, Apollon Delacour pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. Lupin looked at the ceiling and then at his hands and then at Harry with the expression of someone who had chosen the right thing to be in the corner of. Vane looked at the ceiling too, for a longer moment, with the specific quality of someone thinking about someone who should have been in the room. Harry caught his eye. Vane gave a slight nod, acknowledgement, something like peace. Harry nodded back. Outside the ICW chambers, in the August afternoon of Geneva, the 4 of them stood on the steps of the oldest formal building Harry had ever been in, and the day was warm and bright and the city below the hill was ordinary in all the ways cities were ordinary, and the threads between all 3 of them were the warmest they had ever been. Charter protection, Hermione said. Internationally binding. Any ministry-level interference is now an ICW violation. Yes, Fleur said. Umbridge will try anyway. She can try, Harry said. She'll find out what the last 5 people who tried found out. Hermione smiled. Not the polite one or the careful one but the full one, the one she'd had since the Gringotts steps when she was 11 years old. Fleur looked at her and then at Harry and then at the city below, and her expression had the quality it always had when she'd decided something, settled, complete, present. What happens now? She said. Harry thought about the darkness that was back in the world and the fragment in the scar and the plan that was his now rather than Dumbledore's and the research that said the bond's architecture had the capacity for what was coming. He thought about Lupin saying I choose to be and Ron with his infinite coat and vain sister who deserved better and the letters that still smelled of lavender and books. He thought about his father's sealed letter, still waiting in the vault for when he was 17, which was 3 years away, and about the fact that he was not afraid of what was in it. He thought about a boy in a cupboard who had lost control of the truest part of himself and sent it outward in a pulse of white gold light, and the 2 people who had felt it and written back and meant every word. Now, he said, we decide everything else. Fleur took his arm. Hermione took his other hand. 3 points of a triangle, all edges real, the bond fully formed and fully chosen and formally recognized by every authority that had any standing to recognize it, and beyond the reach of anyone who had ever thought to unravel it. They went down the steps together into the ordinary extraordinary afternoon. The bond was warm. The threads were quiet. Everything else was ahead.